Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 661 Formation Membrane. The next day, the first without Alzalsar, showed no changes at all. The world didn't seem to care that their biggest backer had left, not even enough to double down on them. Seth felt a lot better after spending time with Mina and decided to deal with some minor stuff, before paying Lena a visit. "Evan, these are for you." "What are these?" the tame-returned champion of Hermes asked with glowing eyes when the blacksmith handed him 3 shiny, crystalline eggs. At first, Seth hesitated to give Evan the eggs, in case they also bore the weird disease. But there had been nothing wrong with the worms in the cave when he entered, which made him believe that the one that attacked them was a rogue one that was infected earlier and split from the group. "They are the eggs of dungeon worms. Here's the info I got from Lena about them. They are a great source of materials, but even if you can't breed them, they should be quite useful for construction projects. Especially their tunneling seemed really useful, even though the only big projects Seth could come up with at the moment was a sewer system for the tree stations. It was hard for Karina to grow one from roots, but if Evan could control the worms, they could add sewers, even to a finished city. Of course, this kind of stuff would have to be left to actual architects and city planners. Seth had no real clue about the details of such work. "Yes, Tower Master. I will not disappoint you," Evan said, motivated, and scampered off, hugging his new babies. When Seth turned, he felt something tugging on his shirt. Looking down, he faced the depressed gaze of Ellie. "Why is it always Evan getting cool stuff? Can't you just find me a cool special slime or something?" she asked with a pout. Hearing her mention cool special slime reminded Seth of something. Although he had nothing to give her, maybe she would cheer up hearing something new? "You heard of the voracious cloud continent, right?" he suddenly asked. She nodded. Ellie had heard the rough outline of what was going on with that. "Did you know that they have something called a demon jelly, that actually has a spatial attribute? They actually make spatial equipment from their cores." Ellie's eye shone, hearing new slime trivia. "Can we travel there at some point in the future?" she asked eagerly. "Maybe if stuff calms down in Delta," the blacksmith answered vaguely. Seth wasn't too eager to throw himself into a world that had the potential to be even more dangerous than Earth. Especially with a completely different culture and power system. The things he heard from Alzalsar and Master Mountain really dampened his wish to explore the place for materials. After giving Evan the eggs and placating Ellie, he left the 2 tamers to their own devices. Next, he called Lena about Alzalsar's solution. Lena was bound to know of Al as she was responsible for Project Ego, but they never met personally. So he had to give a short introduction to Al, before talking about their barrier that needed testing. He didn't go into the details, since Seth himself didn't quite understand them, but he asked whether she had a way to test it. Hearing that Minasmar may already have a solution, the princess immediately invited the blacksmith to the northern fort. She led him straight to a room filled with figures in white coats. Lena explained to him that these were the doctors, a unit of the Krna Empire that specialized in dealing with the exotic and alien diseases found in other worlds. A man she introduced as the head researcher took a while to analyze the copy of the adjusted schematics he brought. "This is your solution?" he asked after finishing. "Your Highness, this has nothing to do with medical magic or medicine. This is a soul-whisking formation." "What? Seth, where did you get this?" she suddenly asked hysterically. From one moment to the other, people stared at him with shock, and the blacksmith got a slight suspicion that something was wrong. "Al taught it to me. Why do you ask?" he said carefully. "It was better to push this on the sorceress for now." "Where is Alzalsar now?" "She left Delta yesterday for personal business." "Would you explain why you react like this?" Seeing how he didn't know what exactly was going on, Lena took a deep breath and calmed herself down, before she started to explain. Knowledge of this kind of magic is strictly controlled and prohibited for most people. It's strictly banned because of the possibilities for abuse. It was judged as a war crime by the Krna Convention agreed upon by most of the empires active across the Pathworks. Seth couldn't help but admit that it made sense. Not everyone had a way to protect their souls as Seth did. If such a formation was used on a large scale on something like a battlefield, or even a city, a magic that could kill silently and without any previous indicators, completely ignoring the target's strength, was especially terrifying. "I see your point, but do you have any better ideas? What makes you think this will work? Did you already test it?" a doctor asked curiously. "This one in particular? No. That is why I'm here. Alzalsar lowered the power to the point where it's harmless to a normal person. But she said it may need some more testing and adjustments. That would be your job, no? Seth didn't intend to reveal that he knew the original formation and that he had already tested it on the infected. Things may have gone much smoother if he did, but revealing the videos would disclose too many of the secrets he wished to keep. Instead, he bet on the fact that he had found no other viable way to effectively kill the infected he worked on. These doctors had probably been busy experimenting the whole day, yesterday. Judging from Lena's readiness to ask him for his solution, they had yet to find a good way to deal with it. Whether they liked it or not, this was a potential solution. Even if he didn't bring any evidence, they couldn't ignore this option now. Seth observed the wordless dialogue between the head researcher and the princess. Judging by their expressions, the doctor was much less opposed to testing the prohibited magic than the princess. As expected from a scientist. Fine, fine. I brought you here. Let's test this. Lena finally gave up and the doctors. Quickly and professionally, the doctors started to lay out the formation as described in the schematics. It needed some special materials, but they had everything in stock. A magic circle quickly took shape in a specially prepared room. It wasn't the only one. Several more were installed as safety measures. Their next step confused Seth a little, as they brought a massive urn that was shaking violently. Don't tell me. Seth mumbled. Yes, we sealed their bodies in these magic and airtight containers after they went inactive. We didn't expect them to somehow recover while inside. The men carrying the urn placed it in the middle of the formation and quickly left the room. The test was relatively simple. They would remotely unseal the urn and then activate Seth's formation. The moment the seal on the urn was released, the top of the urn shot off with tremendous force and the urn fell over. From inside crept a terrible creature, barely human in shape. Many limbs and body parts were fused together with a mass of what was most easily described as molten flesh. A black sludge was trickling off its body and also flowing out from the urn. It needed a moment to find its bearing before directly charging toward the observation window. Everyone was standing behind. However, the moment it passed the line that indicated the border of the barrier, or rather the magic membrane, it suddenly started disintegrating into a reddish sludge, making the floor look like a bloodbath. Everyone was shocked at the unexpected result, especially Seth. In his test the infected had merely fallen lifeless, leaving an intact corpse. It didn't disintegrate like that. Don't look at me like this. I also didn't see that coming. Maybe we should do more tests. Chapter 662 58 minutes. 58 minutes ugh. Her whole body was immersed in the sensation of reverse pooping, a feeling she had gotten used to over the past weeks. Tired, she flopped down on the giant bed. Giant for the size of a fairy, that is. Finn had been working hard to prolong the time she could spend in a human size, to the point she could now transform for almost one whole hour, to the point she seldomly left her own room at this point. It would have been a lie to say that Seth's engagement with Mina didn't depress her a little, but she knew that Mina supported her. Finn came from a background of nobility. It was not weird for someone to have more than one wife if both agreed. This was why she didn't stop working on improving. She also didn't just train to become a human, but also different kinds of beasts that could help increase her power in combat, like that one time in Sigma. Finn, are you in? A sudden knock on the door and Seth's voice scared her. She was too tired to move. It was one of the side effects if she went to the limit. Ignoring her sore muscles screaming, she hurried to take a more natural pose on the bed before answering. Ah, you can come in. Giving her consent, the door was unlocked by the tower ego. Finn? Oh, are you resting right now? Am I bothering you? No. No, just come in. What did bring you here? She asked hurriedly, trying not to let him notice that her whole body was aching. I finished your items, of course. I know it took a little longer, but had to wait for the right materials. Saying that, he placed an intricate cuirass the size of a thumb on the bed beside the fairy. It was a bright silver with slightly darker inlays covering it, making it like something that should be worn on a necklace, not as armor. The fairy's eyes sparkled, but at the same time, she felt tears in the corners of her eyes. She wanted to try it on right away. But her body felt like creaking old wood that would splinter if he moved too quickly. Is it not to your liking? Seth asked worriedly. No. No, I love it. I'm just so touched. I want to appreciate it a little longer. She hurriedly found an excuse. All right. Want me to explain its effects while you appreciate it? He asked with a smirk. Oh no, he knows something is up, she screamed internally. Yes please, go ahead, she pressed out. Alright. Well, as you can see, it's a cuirass made of legendary Olympian silver with inlays of Erdhan Ithildan. It helps with magic and skills but especially improves melee combat thanks to the Anthem of Violence. I know you prefer robes, but you will have no problems moving in this. The reason it took so long, was that I waited for a soul with a special trait. This cuirass has the trait of a shapeshifter and will follow the shape of its wearer. So no matter what you turn into, the cuirass will take an appropriate shape. You know about it? Finn exclaimed horrified. Seth wasn't supposed to know. She wanted to surprise him once she was ready, one her heart was. Of course. I heard you learned some kind of gigantification skill. Don't worry, even if you turn into a giant again, like in Sigma, the cuirass will protect you. The tiny brute's heart calmed again. He didn't know, she just misunderstood. And for the finish, this cuirass holds the blessing of Arki. She was a titan and messenger goddess, unfortunately for the wrong side. The skill allows you to break out in divine speed for a short amount of time. You will be intangible to physical attack over the duration of the skill. Hearing that, her calmed heart started beating faster again. She was in a panic before, but she finally got to process what Seth just told her. Even more importantly, she could simply wear the cuirass on top of her robe, so she didn't lose anything. The amount of damage she would be able to cause and the possibilities this opened up for battle. Especially since she could keep using this in other forms, unlike her other items which were restricted to humanoid bodies only. You seem to be a little sore, I understand if you don't equip it right away. Just let me see how it fits before we leave, okay, he said with a cheeky smirk and left. Finn screamed internally. He had known the whole time. How embarrassing. That he unsuccessfully tried to hide it made it even more embarrassing. Finn's armor was the last item he had to deliver. The doctors of Krana believed him after a few tests, and Seth left the fine-tuning of the soul-whisking membrane to them. The blacksmith had spent the past days completing the rest of the items for his friends. With a week to go, he had just delivered the last item to Finn, hoping she would be able to master it somewhat before they reached the Holy Land. With his preparations for his friends finished, he turned to himself again. In the department of crafting, all his skills were still at level 1 of the master tier, though enchantment was already past 50%. His singing skill and the earth magic had stagnated a little since he didn't really have the time to concentrate on them. One would think the forging ballads would help improve at least singing, but they counted more towards enchantment than singing. However, with a week to go, he probably wouldn't be able to learn another spell, nor would he be able to significantly raise his proficiency in singing. He came to an empty guest room and put 2 bottles on the bedstand. One was Allison's potion. The alchemist had checked and told him that he would be able to take the next dosage without problems. The second was a jade bottle given to him by Master Mountain for his help with Alzalsar. Inside were 5 earth-ranked body refining pills. Although Seth had no idea how helpful they would be, he wouldn't say no to anything that could help him become stronger. The information they had gotten from the guild about their holy land had made the blacksmith relieved about the preparations he had done so far. The reports talked about expansive dungeons with massive caverns, filled with beasts stronger than their levels may suggest. Many of the dungeons had a minimum level of 80, with many of them having broken out several times ever since the apocalypse. Even when the no man's land and especially the mountain range had become more dangerous since the complete synchronization of Earth with the Pathworks, the guild's holy land, and its surroundings were even a notch above this. This was a blessing for the people that had been stuck at the higher levels, but even if all of them stormed the mountain range, they wouldn't be enough to bring it back down to previous levels. Sometimes he thought it was quite ironic. There were over 1 billion people in Krana, but the number of high-level people was barely in the thousands. Once enough people had stepped up to protect the status quo, most people fell back in their way, almost as if the world wasn't trying to kill them with all kinds of supernatural bullshit. Well, it wasn't Seth's concern. He just had to protect what he had, and if he had a hand free, he would reach out to those in need. Maybe. But for that, he needed excess strength. Throwing his head back in his neck, he gulped down Allison's potion, once again improving all his physical attributes by 5 points. Next, he eyes the bottle of pills. Seth decided on this order because you mentioned in his explanation that the body refining pill would get rid of toxins and impurities. If that was true, Seth hoped that it would enable him to take his 4th portion of Allison's potion before they left for the Holy Land. Chapter 663 Body Refining. According to you, one of these pills was enough for the initial cleansing of a cultivator, eating more wouldn't have any big effect. However, Seth counted as an ordinary person, and according to Master Mountain, he would have to swallow at least 3 for the same effect. He also mentioned that it would not be pleasant for an ordinary person. Well, Seth took offense to being called ordinary, but he was no cultivator. That much was true. Here goes nothing. He steeled his heart and threw the pill down his gullet. It was a thick piece of medicine to swallow without anything to drink, and the blacksmith doubted for a moment whether cultivators had a gag reflex. When he finally got it down, he could feel a warmth growing in his stomach. It was different from a potion, which felt technically just like a coolness spreading across one's body, followed by a notification of the effects. The warmth quickly grew into a heat, and soon Seth could feel some kind of energy rampaging through his body. This had to be the pill's medical power. It was chaotically emanating from his stomach. He started sweating profusely, and wave by wave he could feel it pulse through his body with some measure of pain. Each time it ripped little pieces away from his body and out of his flesh, pushing them out, after which the wave of power would dissipate outside his body. There was a lot of power, but compared to what it managed to push out, each wave felt like a waste of this precious energy. Not to mention the pain he had to endure with each wave. After a few moments of getting used to it, Seth had an idea. Master Mountain mentioned that it was uncomfortable for non-cultivators. From what the blacksmith understood, the biggest thing about cultivators was their way of cultivating energy. Well, they weren't the only ones who could do that. Seth may not have chi, or whatever they called their internal energy, but he had magic power and energy manipulation 3. If he managed to control the course of the energy, would he be able to gain more? Maybe he wouldn't have to swallow 3 pills. Clumsily at first, Seth tried controlling the medicinal power of the pill directly with his energy manipulation skill, which didn't work at all. However, he was able to guide the power by guiding his magical power originating from his mana. The joy of having managed to guide it vanished quickly when he realized that he had no idea where to guide it. He knew that cultivators used some kind of cycle to guide power through their bodies, but he had no idea about the specific. He had no idea how cultivators did anything, but he was a spirit blacksmith, and there was something similar burned in his mind. There was a time when he had to guide energy through his body. That was when he created Karen's obel, his personal blacksmith hammer. It had been part of the creation process that bound them together. He had no idea whether it would work, but there was no reason not to try. Worst case, he wasted some of the pill's power. Since he didn't know how to do it without, Karen's obel also appeared in his hands, and he started guiding the energy through his body and the hammer, as he had done when he created it. Seth kept his eyes tightly shut as he concentrated on the energy cycle of Karen's obel. He created a cycle between him and the hammer, and it felt a lot better than before, at least. There was still the feeling of something being removed from him, but it was much gentler than the powerful waves. Whether this really was better than when the energy waves just blasted through his body, he didn't know. It wasn't hard to guess that these were the toxins and impurities being released from his body. He could feel that it became harder to guide the more was released from him, which probably meant that the particles were flowing with the guided energy, just as they did previously with the waves. Instead of being pushed out through his skin, they vanished together with a big part of the medical power when the energy flowed through Karen's obel. It was as if the hammer devoured them, just like materials and souls during the crafting process. Seth didn't mind. The energy lost to Karen's obel was still less than the waves that simply blasted out from his body. With everything under a sort of control, he could finally concentrate on the feeling of refinement. Removing the toxins was not comfortable, but it left a feeling of refreshment in his body. He also detected some changes. It was hard to describe, but it felt like his flesh had become denser, or rather, more robust. The blacksmith didn't know for how long he had been circulating, but he found that the number of particles had not only decreased by a little more than half when the power of the first pill was used up. Looking at the clock, he found that he had been immersed in the process for roughly 2 hours. He grimaced in disgust when he smelled himself. The stench was disgusting, and his skin was covered in a layer of grease. The original process had not been going on for long, and this was the result of that. If he had been sitting here for the full 2 hours at the start. Seth understood why you advised him to do it in a room that was easy to clean. There were no changes to Karen's obel at all, but there was quite a bit to his status. Although the system had not given him any announcement, he found that his endurance had increased by a whopping 20 points, while his strength improves by 15 and dexterity and agility improved by 10 each. With this, his endurance had become his third highest attribute with 256 points. The power of body refinement was crazy, even if these were only one-time effects. Since the particles had decreased by roughly half, maybe he could gain the same amount of attributes again with the second pill. This also meant he was faring better than ordinary people since he could probably do with only 2 instead of 3 pills. Take that, you. Then he would have enough pills for another person to go through body refinement. He stood up and stretched his limbs a little before sitting down again to get ready for the next pill. He popped it in his mouth, and the heat immediately started building up in his stomach. This time, Seth started circulating the energy immediately. As the impurities got less and less, the circulation was able to become much faster, showing quicker progress. After an hour or so, Seth could not feel the flow being slowed down by anything anymore. However, he kept circulating since Karen's obel kept absorbing the energy or the pills. Ding! Karen's obel has grown to a relic rating. Ding! You have attained a special feat, Hammer Unity. You are now able to become one with the hammer and use it even more effectively. Seth could feel it, it was as if a wall had crumbled down. Karen's obel did not feel like an item or a tool anymore but like a part of his body. Now he did not need Blacksmith's eyes anymore to see the effects and powers of the hammer, he could feel them like they were his own. The Blacksmith could feel the changes the evolution had brought to the hammer, and the energy from the body refining pills had no small role in the matter. When he opened his eyes and looked at the hammer, he found that it was covered in forge scale. It wasn't unlike the muck that covered Seth's skin. Rubbing it off a little, he used Blacksmith eyes to confirm whether what he sensed was true or not. Karen's obel. Relic, growth. Damage, 1300. Durability 7000. 1 plus 50% damage in dark places. 2 plus 30% dark damage. 3 devouring and refinement. 4 50% chance to imbue an item with additional elemental effects. 5 20% chance to imbue an item with a strong magical effect. 6 75% mana cost. Like the coin needed to pay the ferryman Karen, to bring the souls to the underworld, this hammer is needed for a soul to find a new purpose in the hand of a spirit smith. Karen's obel is used to directly forge and damage souls. The hammer grows by feeding on souls, energy, and materials. Plus 50% chance to stagger enemies. Plus 20% damage to armor. Karen's obel can forge any material but consumes mana corresponding to the change in the structure of anything that is not metal. Only works on the anvil of Tartarus. Karen's obel can automatically refine organic materials during the forging process. Karen's obel can take the shape of other forging hammers. Other options will be unlocked upon growth. Looking at its description, he found that a lot had changed and it confirmed what he felt. All the options had become stronger or outright grew. The most obvious was slow digestion plus, which had now become devour and refinement, which meant that Karen's obel would not just absorb stuff, but also refine it. This effect became most clear when he looked at the options to imbue items with effects. Although the description from his appraisal did not give a comprehensive list of magical effects like before, he could feel that the random effects had been cut down by a lot. Before there had been a lot of magical effects, mostly weak ones, that had a chance to be attached to an item. Many of which would have actually gotten in the way of the item, instead of being any helpful. For example, if he wanted to make a weapon with a strong ice elemental damage, having the hammer imbue it with a weak fire effect, in addition, would have only weakened the original enchantment and muddled the arcane design of the item. He was lucky that the chance had been rather low before. Now the chance of elemental effects was higher, however, unlike before when it was random, it now had the word additional. Through his connection, he could sense that it meant that the hammer would either strengthen the already existing elemental effects or add complementary ones. It was similar in the case of the magical effects that had no elemental affinities. The number of effects had been drastically shrunk, but he could sense the ones that were left were strong. Devour and refinement had gotten rid of the weak and useless ones and refinement and combined the stronger ones. This meant the Karen's obel would not only have a chance to imbue the effects of materials he had previously absorbed, but also unique combinations of effects. The new growth had also changed the unique options of Karen's obel. Being able to feed on energy was added, while the option to refine organic materials during the forging process was added, and the option to change shape was unlocked. Although he would have to test this, Seth understood it to be similar to folding steel to slowly forge out impurities. His hammer now had the effect to get rid of impurities in organic materials, when forging them using its power. As for changing shape, it was a quality of life option. Some steps in crafting needed a hammer in a specific shape. With this option, Seth would not have to change tools when he wanted to drive more material or peen something, for example. His hands shook a little in excitement, as he thought of all the new possibilities, and then he smiled wryly. Why did he wait with the pills for this long? Well, he didn't expect them to be able to improve Karen's obel in this way and even help it to finally grow to the relic rank. It was just, if he had done it sooner, they may have helped improve the items for his friends even further. Now, he could only shrug. What happened, happened, and he let bygones be bygones. After marveling over his hammer for some time, he finally thought of checking his status, finding that the second run had been slightly weaker. It added 15 points to endurance, 10 to strength, and 7 to dexterity and agility each. His stats had majorly improved with these two pills, with his base strength now almost reaching 300 points. When his excitement ebbed down a little, he noticed the terrible stench again. Right. He hurried to take a bath now. Status window. Name, Seth Smith. Mark of Ivisor. Olympian myths, Hades, strong, Hephaestus, moderate, Apollo, weak, Eos, weak. Kin of fire. Blood of the inventor. Blessing, Hades, Hephaestus, Seth. Title, faster than the thought. Level, 72. EXP, 56%. Race, Orihuma. Sex, male. Age 24. Class, Spirit Blacksmith, unique, / Infernal Scald, unique. Affiliation, System Church, Mar. Health, 1000/1000. Mana, 235 plus 6300, INTX 30. Strength 291. Dexterity 278. Agility, 248. Intelligence 210. Willpower 231. Endurance 271. Personality, 144. Luck 130, 50 plus 15 plus 2. Free AP, Attribute points 8. Universal AP 8. Free SP, Skill points 1. Defense. Physical, 2316, 1897 plus 50 plus 325 plus 44, ENDX 7. Magical, 1117, 924 plus 25 plus 150 plus 18, WILX 4. Fire immunity. Earth resistance, 65%. Light resistance, 35%. Wind resistance, 15%. Water resistance, 13%. Poison resistance, 25%. Frost resistance, 10%. Resistance to mental attacks, 10%. 25% resistance to diseases. Titles. Title, faster than the thought. Title, Lucky Bastard. Title, Explorer. Title, Bold. Title, Arsonist leave 2 Pyromaniac. Title, Overachiever. Title, Shut In. Title, Giant Slayer. Title, Survivor. Title, Snake That. Title, Master Skywalker. Title, Survivalist Deviant Leave 2. Title, Dungeon Conqueror. Title, Divine Tamer. Title, Flaming Savage. Title, Dragon Slayer, Minuscule. Title, Bad Boy. Title, Stronk. Title, Twinkle Fingers. Title, Headstrong. Title, Brainy. Title, Fleet-Footed. Title, World's Best Blacksmith. Title, Struggling Artist. Title, One of Fire. Title, Creator plus 10 to the attributes of all inventions. Title, Dreamy. Title, Divine Creator. Title, Acknowledged by the Gods. Title, Composer of Death. Title, Resurrector of Lore. Title, Civil. Title, Apollo Proved. Title, Muscle Man. Title, Quick Hands. Title, Boneheaded. Title, Iron Plate. Title, Fortune's Favored. Title, Master Enchanter. Title, The First, Enchanter. Title, Brainiac. Title, Master Goldsmith. Title, The First Two. Title, Master Blacksmith. Title, The First Three. Chapter 664 Melting Away. After a long shower in the bath of the guest room, there were 2 things on his mind. For one, the 3 leftover pills. He already decided on giving them to Mina. During the shower, he found that his skin had become a lot smoother and softer thanks to the refinement. What miracles would they bring for someone who started off as a beauty like Mina? The other was that his fingers were itching to try the new option of Karen's obol. He needed to give it a good work over to get rid of the forge scale anyway, and the blacksmith already had something in mind for what to make. Although he was done with all the items he wanted to finish for his friends before the expedition to the Holy Land, it wasn't like a blacksmith needed a reason to make cool items. Wasn't this how it usually went in fantasy stories? A revered blacksmith would make a great item and then look for someone worthy to wield his stellar work? Right now, a great item had been waiting for him to make it, but Seth had been pushing it back because he didn't know anyone fit to use it. The Horn of the Kylan, as Master Mountain had called it, or rather the fragment of the horned serpent. A special rated material from an otherworldly deity. It had been collecting dust in Seth's inventory because he knew no warrior that used the ice or water elements. Melee classes that had a connection to elemental powers usually used fire, wind, or earth for their buffs in damage, speed, and defense respectively. People with more ordinary classes that lacked an elemental specialization were not even in Seth's consideration. Delta's only prominent ice user was Elsa, but she was already a chosen and she was a mage. With the materials already being in the natural shape of a sword, it would have broken Seth's heart to turn it into a staff. For the same reason, Shay, the ice mage from Monique's team, was also out of the question. For this reason, he had kept pushing back working with the fragment. Yet now was a perfect time. He was technically free for the moment and it met the criteria to test Karen's obol. It was an organic material that only needed some refinement to make for a good sword. Twirling the hammer in his hand, he strolled to his workshop thinking of what kind of sword to make. The overall shape of the fragment lent itself perfectly for a two-handed longsword. Something along the lines of a Zweihander or a claymore. They weren't the most popular weapons out there, as the standard for most warriors was to go for a type of longsword. Second to longswords were only spears and axes. Still, Seth was confident anyone would jump at the chance to get a legendary weapon, even if it was not their preferred weapon of choice. "You seem in a good mood, Seth," Whedon commented when he saw the Tower Master walk by his workshop. "Oh, yeah. It's been a good day so far and I just had a great idea for an item," Seth replied with a smile. "Really, can I watch?" the young dwarf asked with sparkling eyes. The last time he had allowed the dwarfs to watch, they had gained a lot from it, although Seth had felt a little embarrassed being watched. Since then, everyone had been busy with things, so they had not gotten the chance to repeat it. "Are you that free?" he asked back. "I just finished a big order for an armor set and was going to finish for today." "I'm free." "Me too." Hone suddenly entered the conversation with a bright smile. "If there is a chance to watch the master work, I won't let it slip by," he spoke enthusiastically. Seth scrutinized them with sharp eyes in the hope of discouraging them, but he was almost blinded by the light in their eyes. These forging fanatics were shameless and unbridled. "Ah, may I also watch?" a third voice butted in. "I know, I'm a goldsmith, but I would also like to watch the Tower Master work on a weapon," Oriabel asked hesitatingly. Seth could only sigh and surrender to his fate, that he would have 3 pairs of eyes watching him today. Fine, come in. I don't think it will hurt anyone if you watch for a little." He ground the weird slag off the hammer, revealing a smooth black surface below before he attempted to start on the sword. With the peanut gallery sitting opposite his anvil, Seth brought out the fragment of the horned snake. He could already hear the ohs and ahs of the dwarfs as they laid their eyes upon an almost natural sword. The blacksmith equipped his crafting gloves and circulated his energy through Karen's obol, becoming one with the hammer. A sudden cold made the 3 peanuts shiver when Seth's voice echoed through the workshop in an alien language. This was the ballad of Jekulaz, a demon of pure ice, known for his freezing whines. If it wasn't for the bellowing flames of the forge behind him, the temperature in the workshop may have actually fallen below freezing. He started swinging his hammer and with each swing, he forced some of his energy into the horn. Simultaneously he paid off the demon with souls, through channeling, and the demonic runes of power sank into the material. Before using energy manipulation 3 in addition to the hammer own ability was a necessary step to make the material malleable. Now, by transferring the energy through the hammer, it also had the same refining effect as the medical energy of the pill and the blessing of the hammer that bestowed effects. With every hit, he felt the energy filling the blade, and its color darkened with the demonic runes entering. He was slowly and carefully shaping it, giving it an even edge geometry and getting it ready for sharpening, when suddenly his hammer hit and his heart dropped. The surface of the blade cracked like porcelain and flaked away like a forged scale. The indigo blue blade had lost its luster and cracks covered the surface, spreading from the hit. Seth started sweating hard. The dwarfs and Ori were watching him. To commit such a blunder, the worst was that he didn't even know what went wrong. He calmed his heart and breath and focused on not letting them notice that something was wrong. With a waxen face, the hammer rose again, and he hit the flaky surface of the sword. More pieces crumbled off. He hit again and more pieces fell. He didn't show it to the outside, but he was panicking internally. What had happened to the sword? With each hit, the claymore blade that had already taken shape shrunk like a melting iceberg. He was close to losing his cool completely when he spotted a glimpse of hope. Where a big part of the once broad blade broke away, he saw a bright glance of metal that stood in stark contrast to the indigo blue that lost its luster. Seeing the silver lining on the horizon, he started hammering with reinvigorated swings. As more big chunks broke away, he finally realized what had happened. The color had not darkened because of the demonic forging ballad. It was the refining energy in addition to his strikes had moved the impurities to the outside, forming a thick layer of slag, which was the crumbling surface. He just had to break it away and be left with the purified material. He just didn't expect to lose this much material through the refining process. With a laughing and a crying eye, he watched the mighty claymore shrink. It was already past the domain of a longsword. What had started with the idea of making a big meaty ice sword and turned into something closer to a rapier, or maybe a hybrid of rapier and sword. In exchange, the material had become a lot more beautiful. The color had turned from an indigo blue to a deep sky blue, and the aura of ice was so dense that it formed frost atop the anvil of Tartarus. The effect of just the material was beyond expectation. It was just a shame that it was reduced by this much. Seth didn't have any dislike for a rapier-style sword, but it was even less popular than a two-handed sword since it needed a lot of skill and technique to be used effectively. So a rapier it was. This meant he had to slightly change his plans on the fly. He was just glad that he had not planned any intricate enchantments, since he intended to concentrate on the ice effects and see what Karen's obel would add to the mix. Using Blueprint, he quickly checked schematics for all kinds of rapiers, finally finding one that fit the current shape of the material. It was meatier than the usual rapier, closer to a hybrid of longsword and rapier, which would give it ample power for stabbing and slashing. Forging the blade into shape didn't take a lot of time, after which came the handle construction. Seth wasn't being cheap and used legendary Olympian silver for the intricate handguard of the rapier. For the handle itself, he used some of the wood of the hanging tree. Ding! You have finished a special item. Ding! An antagonism has refined the power of Jeku laws and changed your item. Ding! The effect of a tool has changed your item. Ding! A synergy between powers has changed your item. Chapter 665 Harbinger of Winter. The peanut gallery was in awe at the rapier that was spewing cold air by simply existing in the room. But the blacksmith's mind was full of questions. What did it mean? The power of the demon was refined. And a special item, not a legendary one? Seth stared at the freezing rapier in his hands incredulously, before hurriedly putting it down, as the ice was starting to build up on his radiant forge right. Harbinger of Winter. Special, growth. Physical damage, 2300. Mag damage, 1200. Durability, 3000. 1 glacial growth. 2 freezing touch. 3 plus 200% ice elemental damage. 4 plus 50% ice affinity. 5 55% chance to freeze on hit. 6 blessing of wind. 7 plus 150% power on skills and spells. 8 double damage to frozen targets. 9 double damage on stabbing attacks. 10 active skill, freezing winds. A weapon filled with the pure and divine aura of ice belonging to a fallen deity. Created by the skilled hands of Master Smith, the first Master Blacksmith of Earth, and empowered by Master Smith, the first Master Enchanter of Earth. The item is not in optimal condition but has the chance to regain its peak performance and even become a divine weapon in the future. There is a low chance that this weapon can lead to the rebirth of a deity. Dave Fuok? This was definitely not what Seth had intended to make. It was great that it could grow past the legendary stage, but what was this about the rebirth of a deity? Trying to make sense of the description, the checked the stats closer. His eyes immediately fell on the culprit for his frozen glove. Freezing touch was an effect that was gradually stacking frost damage on anything that was in tough with the sword. A negative effect for anyone without a high resistance. Then they wandered to glacial growth. Glacial growth, harbinger of winter, absorbs and refines any powers that align with ice or water to grow. This explained the notification that the power of Jekulaz was refined and why the sword still had the associated skill Freezing Winds. Freezing Winds, mana cost, 2000, cooldown, 30 minutes. Summons a gale of freezing winds that hits a target area in front of the user and deals 400% physical damage as ice elemental damage. Freezing Winds has a 75% chance to freeze opponents. The other effects were all in line with what ice weapons could usually do, although very strong. The other effect he was interested in was the ones caused by Karen's Obel, which were actually two. The 50% chance to imbue an elemental effect had given the rapier double damage on frozen targets. But even the 20% chance for a strong magical effect had pressed, giving it double damage on stabs. While the latter was probably an effect refined from the powers it absorbed from materials like Tatzel's Tooth or the Wyvern Fangs, the elemental effect had to be a compound of different effects that had to do with ice and status effects. This was just his conjecture since Seth couldn't pinpoint any one materials that had this kind of effect. He had distracted himself with the effects because he didn't want to think about the elephant in the room. The rebirth of a deity and the rapier having the chance to grow into a divine weapon. What did that even mean? Seth only knew one thing about the rebirth of a god, and that was Yvette Marlowe and the Church of Sam Hatch. From what he heard, it wasn't really something great to be involved in the revival of a divine entity. Although she had gained quite some power by being the saintess, she was also burdened by the god's presence until it was revived by growing the church and belief in it. Who would want a weapon that forced this kind of quest line on them? As if a rapier wasn't already unpopular enough. Is everything alright, Seth? Whedon asked, perturbed at the blacksmith making weird faces in silence. He had completely forgotten that people were currently watching his antics. Combing his hand through his hair, he took a deep breath. Sure. Everything is just fine. I'm going to stop here today, you guys should go back to work, or go eat something. Using excuses, he quickly shooed them out of his workshop, before fixating on the rapier again. It was still innocently lying on the anvil. There was no booming voice or any manipulative feeling that tried to force some kind of crusade on him. At least he had not suddenly become some dead deity's champion by holding the finished blade, nor did it have any usage requirements that could be interpreted in such a way. Despite knowing Yvette's fate, Seth had to admit that this was not the same. There were many interpretations of the sword's flavor text, and he had to admit that he was not knowledgeable enough in the ways of the divine to make the right call here. Although he liked to make everything himself, he was not narrow-minded enough to not ask for people's help. In this case, he would probably have to consult an old friend. But first, he wanted to finish the sword. It was still one step short of being completed according to his original plan. He didn't have a soul for it, nor did he plan on loading it with enchantment. There was only one. The Ice of Kosaitos, the Olympian enchantment he had freed up again by breaking the more than cursed chainmail made from bones of Seth. It was also a good opportunity to see what glacial growth could do to another deity's divine power. With that in mind, he brought the sword over to the enchantment table where he engraved the sigil onto the rapier's pommel. Originating from the sigil, a pattern like a fern frost engraved itself on the whole sword. The frigid air of the weapon became even more biting, but there was no other change or notification. It didn't seem like there were any problems, so Seth checked with Blacksmith's eyes. Harbinger of Winter Woes. Special, Growth. Physical damage, 2400. Mag damage, 1400. Durability, 3150. 1 Glacial Growth. 2 Freezing Touch. 3 plus 210% Ice Elemental Damage. 4 plus 55% Ice Affinity. 5 60% chance to freeze on hit. 6 Blessing of Wind. 7 plus 150% power on skills and spells. 8 double damage to frozen targets. 9 double damage on stabbing attacks. 10 active skill, Aura of Kosaitos, Refining. 11 active skill, Freezing Winds. 12 active skill, Woes of Kosaitos, Refining. A weapon filled with the pure and divine aura of ice belonging to a fallen deity. Created by the skilled hands of Master Smith, the first Master Blacksmith of Earth, and empowered by Master Smith, the first Master Enchanter of Earth. The item is not in optimal condition but has the chance to regain its peak performance and even become a divine weapon in the future. There is a low chance that this weapon can lead to the rebirth of a deity. Some of the effects and the rapier's basic stats had improved. The Olympian enchantment had added 2 skills with the addition of them being in the process of refinement. So it would even refine the blessing power of another deity as long as it was the right element. Did that mean it would return to being the harbinger of winter and change the names of the skill when it was done? Seth pondered about this question as he checked the effect of these skills. Active skill, Kosaito's aura, mana cost, 500 mana, cooldown, 20 minutes. Unleashes a frost nova that freezes hostiles in the surroundings of a 3m radius for up to 15 seconds and deals damage according to the user's magic damage. Active skill, Woes of Kosaitos, mana cost, 2000, cooldown, 24h. Inflicts all hostiles in a range of 30m with the pain of the River of Woes. Targets have 50% chance to be afflicted with the following status effects: freezing, fear, hysteria, confusion, or stun. Seth gulped. If he were to give this sword a massive soul on top of this, it would be seriously frightening. Especially Woes of Kosaitos, although 50% sounded low, it was 50% for each of the effects. Not getting affected by any of them was like winning 5 coin tosses in a row. He carefully places the rapier into a box and put it into his inventory before leaving Mina's march. It was already late, but Seth doubted Simon was already sleeping, and he was proven right when he arrived at the system church. He immediately noticed an obvious change when he arrived at the teleportation hub. There was a new frame installed at the gate to the formation of a light membrane tinged everything beyond it into a slight violet hue. Wasn't this the soul barrier he had given to the doctors? A quick look at his appraisal skill confirmed his suspicions. They had worked really quickly. When Seth crosses the membrane, he could feel a slight prickling, but his soul armaments blocked the weak influence of the formation. Once he crossed, he was immediately blasted with healing magic. My apologies if this surprised you, sir. Traversing the cleansing membrane can take a toll on people, a smiling priestess explained. Is Simon around? You came from Minasmar, right? He's in his study. Chapter 666 Belly of the Beast. A week later, somewhere west of Beta. A long caravan of carriages was traversing the rugged terrain without anything like a road in sight. They had long left the tree route and were traversing westward into the wilderness of the mountains. Snowstorms laden with magic power were constantly raging, forcing them to stay inside the prepared carriages and take shelter from the weather. Ugh, who would have thought that I would rather risk my life in a fight with some monster, than keep being jolted around in his carriage for just a day longer? Ortega lamented. He and the rest of the team of elite Oathguard were seated in one of the carriages closer to the back. They were not the only ones. Almost half of the Oathguard were given the chance to join the field teams on this journey. Distributed over 6 carriages in the back of the long procession were over 70 members of the Oathguard. Aside from theirs, there were also several carriages with chimeras and teams from other guilds of Delta. The Adventurer Guild had prepared several dozen carriages and went far and beyond to get as many people as possible from Delta to join them in their quest to claim their holy land. The place was just that dangerous. Just another day or two and we will be arriving at the base camp. You won't have to endure much longer, but you might end up wishing it would have, the guild representative in their carriage answered his groans with a wry smile. Every carriage had a high-level adventurer as representative of the guild to explain the situation and the plan for the expedition. I still don't get how can there be so many beasts that even the elite teams of the guild couldn't penetrate further in, Anga, the healer of the teams asked again. I mean, I understand that the dungeons keep breaking and spewing out monsters if nobody prunes them, but why is it so excessive in this place? He had kept pestering her on and off about this for the whole journey, but she had kept saying that it was hard to explain. Fine, fine, I will explain it from the beginning, if you will shut up then. She sighed and started. Let's see, where to start. Dungeons have 3 fundamental ways to replenish their monsters. Which method they prefer depends on the core, the location, and the dungeon master. How so? Anga interrupted curiously. The adventurer gave him a biting glare but made a tangent to answer. As you may know, dungeon cores develop from the power of the dungeon god. They have innate properties and preferences based on the location they were born in, but they are not very smart. That's why they summon or appoint a dungeon master to manage the dungeon's function. She paused to see if someone wanted to interrupt again, but everyone was listening more or less interested. Good, if you paid attention, I just mentioned 2 of the 3 methods. A dungeon can recruit local beasts as fighters in the dungeon, or use its energy to summon them from other realms. The third method would be to build a spawn point and use the dungeon energy to generate mindless drones. Each of the methods has its own advantages and disadvantages. Which method to use would be up to the dungeon master, once appointed. Got that? Anga only nodded, not daring to ask a question. Now, to get to your question. Which method to use is primarily based on the location of the dungeon, as it will dictate how much power it has for growth. A small dungeon would typically try to lure in and recruit local beasts for defense, as this is the cheapest option. The next best would be conjuring creatures from other worlds. Although the transfer will cost energy, these beasts are often stronger and more intelligent, making it the most effective option at the start. Building spawn points on the other hand take time and energy, but creating drones would be cheaper, later on, compared to summoning individual monsters. Of course, for all methods count, the stronger the beast, the more energy is needed to ensnare it. Apart from some exceptions. This is just a rough outline, but as you can see, the greatest restriction to the growth of a dungeon is the energy the dungeon has at its disposal. The Holy Land is not just a place with a myriad of deep natural caves, but also a knot where several dragon veins meet. With as much energy as they need, the dungeons were able to constantly grow, strengthen, and break as much as they wanted and develop in any which way they wanted. That is why it's overflowing with powerful beasts vying for supremacy. But if we can conquer them, and get them under control, they will be a massive source for growth to the people of Earth. The group inside the carriage was silent for a moment. They had stayed their whole life in Delta and it was the first time they heard this much about the function of a dungeon. You mentioned summoning creatures from other realms. Is that happening randomly against their will, or where do they come from? Morgana asked a question that kept bothering her. What of these creatures were just as unwilling to fight inside these terrible arenas as them? Are you going to feel sympathy for the beasts that come to kill your people? She asked wryly as if she read her thoughts. It's a pointless notion. Most of them are creatures that also follow the dungeon god for their own reasons. Let me ask you, do you think you are the only ones that don't die in the dungeon? The representative looked with a satisfied smirk into the stumped faces of oath guards. Where do you think the experience and items you lose upon death go? Exactly, many of the intelligent creatures you meet in dungeons enter it for the same reasons you do. They just stand on the other side. But why do dungeon break then? Why would they risk their lives and leave a place they can always revive in? Ortega threw in. It was one thing to accept that the monsters in a dungeon were technically immortal, the same as adventurers were. But if they had the same perks as them, wouldn't it also mean that they would be able to permanently die outside of dungeons? Now, you are asking the right questions. Well, what could be the reason for a people or beasts to use a means of interdimensional travel to fall into another world and wantonly murder the native populace? Any idea? She looked into their faces and could see that some of them got the hint, others not so much. Conquest. New lands, new territories. New prey to feast upon, resources to plunder, and land to govern. There are a lot of reasons, but technically the dungeons are not much different from the pathworks, except that they are better regulated and maybe a little farther spread, she ended mysteriously. Everyone fell silent. They needed time to grasp the magnitude of what they had just heard. There are humans and humanoid races coming through the pathworks, but why is it only monsters in the dungeons? Calder, the team's archer asked indignantly. The high-level adventurer suddenly smiled with a crazed look and their pearly whites shone eerily in the dim carriage. That's why I said it's better regulated. This is the dungeon god's mercy. You wouldn't want to see what the humans that get access to the dungeons do to the world of monsters as you call them. Before anybody could say anything more they heard the signal of a loud horn. We are about to breach the first ring. Everyone grab something and hold tight, the representative suddenly screamed and the carriage started rocking shortly after like a boat on the stormy sea. Looking out of the window, they could see almost nothing in the rampant storm that had grown stronger by several levels. Hold on tight. We will break through soon. After shaking for several minutes they all had the feeling of their stomach trying to leave through their throat. The feeling of falling, a moment of weightlessness, and then a sudden impact made the first feeling almost come true. Looking outside, the situation had changed completely. There was no blizzard, no massive storm, not even a lot of snow. The mountains still looked desolate, but there were little signs of life. Moss and lichen made the landscape look almost verdant compared to the ice desert they had traversed previously. We entered the outer rim. Welcome to the belly of the beast. Chapter 667 The Holy Land. The caravan had halted in a steep valley with the several dozen carriages in disarray. People who had not taken too well to the breach were emptying their stomachs, while others were looking in fascination in the direction they had come from. The oath guards disembarked their carriage, facing a complete change in environment. A weird orange light was shining from an almost clear sky, and one wouldn't believe how much warmer it was compared to the frozen mountains they had traversed to get here. Ortega was speechless, staring at a wall of wind and snow behind them. It was a perpetual storm and they were in its eye. The curtain of clouds ran from left to right as far as his eyes could see. From the briefing, they knew that it was similar to the one between the mountain range and the western desert. A phenomenon created by meteorology and natural mana. It created a massive boundary, leading to a change in the climate. Outside raged a snowstorm, but the inside was calm and almost warm with a clear sky. Aside from the weird light, this place could almost be called verdant with moss and lichen growing here and there on the barren rocks. We will rest here shortly and use mounts for the rest of the way. We should be able to reach the camp by evening, the caravan leader announced to the assembled army. His words were met with cheers and sighs of relief. Everyone was happy that they did not need to stay inside the carriages anymore. Although the place was a little weird, the journey past the tree route was hard on the expedition members. Not because of the danger of the place, but because they had traveled stealthily. Despite nobody in the expedition lacking the confidence to fight their way through the mountain range up to this point, it had been a decision made by the Adventurer Guild that they would try and avoid any fights along the route. This was why they had been forced to stay cooped up in the small carriages enchanted with resistance against the elements and recognition inhibition. For many, this was a worse experience than simply fighting monsters in the snow. Ortega kept staring at the orange-tinged sky. The air was cold and fresh, but he could not help to smell something he couldn't quite identify. "What are you doing, Ortega? You should eat something and prepare. It will be a long ride," the guild's representative interrupted his thoughts as she was packing away the carriage in her inventory. "Ah, sorry. I thought I smelled something unfamiliar." Probably the smell of blood? When we advanced through here the first time, we were being surrounded by enemies, with our backs to the storm. The whole valley was covered in blood. Even months later, the smell is still in the air, she commented reminiscent. He did what she did and took a break, but kept thinking of what she said. The smell of blood. No matter how he looked, he could see any trace of battle in the small valley. He couldn't help but to imagine the boulders and rocks covered in blood, the snow tinged red, the small creek flowing in the center turned into a river of blood. Ortega lost his appetite and quickly grew a dislike to the area and became irrationally suspicious of the small clear creek in the center. He was glad when they heard the signal to assemble. He and the others from his carriage walked to the mouth of the valley where a huge crowd of people was still growing. With their lords, the 3 field teams, the 75 members of the Oath Guard, and 60 chimeras, Minasmar made up the second biggest force in the expedition, only overshadowed by the force of the Adventurers Guild itself. On the other hand, were 24 teams of what was left of the elite from the guilds of Delta. The incident with the dungeon worm and the discovery of the disease in the north had been quite the scandal and had led to some power shuffle among the guilds. Some guilds had lost their best people, and others had not sent their elites, but the loss still hit them hard. The Boulder Guild was the unofficial winner of this catastrophe, as they had not only just sent their B team but even their B team came back unharmed. Even with all elites assembled and led by their guild masters, the Boulder Guild was now obviously the strongest force among the guilds of Delta, if Minasmar was excluded. Looking at the obvious difference in the number and quality of equipment, Ortega couldn't help but puff up his chest a little, proud to be part of the Oath Guard and Minas March. Although their armor and weapons may have looked plain compared to some of the fantastical items from the dungeons other teams flaunted, the difference in power was palpable, even without an appraisal still. All teams assembled, according to their faction. When everyone was accounted for, they summoned their mounts. There was a lot of chaos among guilds, as everyone had their individual mounts. Some were massive and imposing, others able to fly, and mixed among them were also quite a few ordinary ones. Again, Ortega couldn't help but be a little proud as he summoned his mount. Most of them owned an alpaca. Although alpacas themselves were not anything special on their own, theirs were cared for by the champion of husbandry and wore custom armor making them especially imposing. From one moment to the other, the Oath Guard had turned into a mounted cavalry. However, they were overshadowed by the chimeras, led by Pardo the orc-headed bear. They actually rode woolly rhinos that had been gifted to them by the people of Mount Agra. They shared their mounts with up to 4 people sitting on one. Ortega looked forward to seeing Puffles, the pet of the Tower Master, steal everyone's show, but when he looked forward, he was faced with a completely different sight. Seth had not brought out Puffles. Puffles had grown tremendously during the time he was out hunting with Python. The blacksmith didn't want to frighten anyone by mounting the massive centipede, Also Puffles was his pet, not his mount. Tatzel was his mount, but despite growing too, he was not big enough to ride on. Facing the problem, that Tatzel would also become really eye-catching once he grew, Seth chose a different route. What appeared at the helm of Mars troops was a pair of massive, armored griffins, with Mina and Seth on their backs. The blacksmith had created Vagrandrijdom with the same method he had used for Asterion, using the chimeric souls and the bodies of the griffin series hunted at Hyperborea. Seth had gifted one to Mina as a mount, so they could ride with a partner look. Aside from acting as mounts, there were also powerful golems far stronger than when they were alive, even though they looked like ordinary griffins. With the oath guards and chimeras exuding an overwhelming presence, the rest of the people from Mar almost fell a little short when it came to mounts, although their mounts were individually more powerful. Seth had not expected that something as objectively cute as an alpaca could look so fierce if clad in a set of uncommon armor. It was Hone who had come up with that idea and worked his butt off to equip all of the oath guards' mounts. It was a shame he couldn't get around to doing the same for the rhinos. Just how badass would they have looked with armor? Once the chaos among the guilds had died down, the caravan leader spoke again and gave the signal to set off. Although many of the mounts assembled could fly, only a few lifted off. At the end of the day, they had to conform to the speed of the slowest mounts of the caravan, so flying ahead wasn't possible, except for the scouts. Although they kept cautioning them about possible monster encounters, nobody in the caravan fought that day. As expected from a road maintained by the Adventurer Guild. The weird orange light inside the eye of the storm slowly grew darker, as the day went on. In the twilight of this orange day, they finally saw the encampment of the Adventurer Guild and got a glimpse at the Holy Land. A massive landscape of canyons, as if a god smacked the planet with a giant hammer and caused a massive lightning bolt-shaped scar on the earth. Chapter 668 No Cherry Picking. Seth riding Vagr, and Mina Andrijdom landed in front of the fortified camp after taking a look at the canyon from the sky. The blacksmith remembered hearing about it in lessons a long time ago, but this was his first time seeing it in real life. If he remembered correctly, it was a mighty river that had carved this scar and the many caves into the landscape, but he was unable to spot it on his short flight. Quite the sight, isn't it? The caravan leader greeted them as they came back. I knew it from the picture, but seeing it in person really is different, Seth agreed. Tower Master? I'm glad you are back. Captain Beamont asked all the leaders to assemble for a briefing. A young adventurer suddenly came running and informed him. We barely arrived and there is already a briefing. Sorry, Mina, I will be right back. He separated from his fiancée and followed the young soldier into the fortified camp, or maybe it was more appropriate to already call it a castle. The camp with enough space for several hundred tents was surrounded by a high and thick stone wall with walkways and watchtowers. Filling a small valley that looked over the canyon and its surrounding land, it was in a position that was hard to attack and easy to defend. The soldier led Seth to one of the big stone buildings in the inner ring, where he also spotted facilities like a smithy. He was led to a big hall with a long wooden table. Along the sides, he saw the leader of the guild teams already seated together with the people from the Adventurer Guild. He sat down at an empty seat beside Brock. Now that we are all here, we can start the briefing. First of all, apologies. I wish I could let everyone take a break and recover from the journey, but the situation does not allow it. I asked everyone to come so quickly because things have changed since the original plan was made. Above the table appeared a rough three-dimensional sketch of the canyon and the land inside the storm. It was labeled Floor 0. The Adventurer Guild treated their holy land as a super dungeon, that was split up into hundreds of individual dungeons. This model showed only the surface and some of the shallowly explored areas they labeled as the first floor. Even though it was just Floor 0, it was already full of tens of differently colored areas. This was the map they were shown prior to their departure. It showed the territories of the different beasts and dungeons that took home inside and were in a state similar to warring nations, defending and trying to expand their territories. The goal of the expedition was for the guilds to pacify all the areas outside the dungeons so the Adventurer Guild could set up a permanent base and a teleportation hub. For this, the canyon had been split into zones with every guild having its own hunting grounds to pacify. In exchange, the guild would have exclusive rights to raid the dungeon in their zones for the next weeks. With the high respawn rate of these high-level dungeons, this was more of a necessity than a reward. However, it was also exactly what the high-level players wanted. Of course, there were still some other deals and rewards arranged, but they were the private business between the Adventurer Guild and the individual guilds of Delta. Officially, this was a project working on mutual benefit. This was the status before your departure. These are changes that happened over the last week. It was the same map, but there had been a great change in colored territories. There were 4 new spots, that had taken over 3/4 of the visible parts of the map. 4 forces from the lower floors have suddenly and aggressively started conquering their way to the surface. This is the state our last scouting party encountered. As you can see, the original separation will not work as many of the original territories have already vanished. The lower floors, the vast cave systems below the canyon, and the surrounding lands and easily led several hundred meters deep into the belly of the mountain range. The Adventurer Guild had not yet succeeded to get a good look at whatever was happening down there. Nobody knew how many floors this super dungeon really had. With little to no knowledge about the place, changes like this were sudden and came without warning. The involved parties could only groan and try to cope with the situation by redistributing sections. Beeman started explaining about the 4 new factions. He pointed at the smallest of the 4s. This small blue space is an aggressive tribe of dragon newts, reptilian hybrids that have a distant blood connection with low-ranking dragons. They show no interest in the local dungeons, but they are very strong and have their territory under tight control. The violet area here are demonic beasts probably led by a maestro. Although the beasts are not very intelligent, they are high in power. There are a few lesser demons among them, that hijack conquered dungeons to summon even more of them, he explained, pointing at the second biggest space. A maestro? Seth thought in surprise. Others around the table didn't seem to quite understand what a maestro was, as none of them so much as reacted to the information. When a demonic bard was a mix of a bard and a blacksmith in demon society, then a maestro was equivalent to an enchanter with the abilities of an alchemist and a monster tamer. Although, calling it a monster tamer was maybe too nice, as they used curses to take control of beasts. Creatures that fall into their hands would be experimented on and strengthened by demonic magic and alchemy. The chimeras the theocracy created in their dungeons were a joke, the botched attempts of a bumbling fool, compared to the demonic creatures of a maestro. Beeman didn't seem to notice Seth's reaction as he faced the 2 biggest spots, that shared a border. Currently at conflict with each other are a kingdom of orcs, Khazdan, and a horde of insects we call the Hive. While the former has a similar strategy as the demons, the Hive simply destroys and absorbs any dungeons on their way. They are the most numerous new power, but their power levels vary tremendously from simple workers to dangerous elite units. The last sentence made one thing clear: nobody wanted to take on the Hive. Not because of the danger or numbers, but because a lot of the people present were interested in the dungeons as a regrowing resource of experience, not the surface cleanup. After they got rid of the built-up forces, there would only be one source of monsters left, instead of dozens. Other dungeons could grow there, but how long would that take? The Dragon Newts are the faction with the most individual strength, but the lowest danger to the dungeons, and they show no signs of expanding their territory any further, for now. Taking our strength into account, I suggest that the guilds of Delta concentrate on the Hive and Aurelia, while the Adventurer Guild will face the Maestro. We can then debate on how to split the rest based on performance. Beeman suggested, including Minasmar as a guild from Delta. Aren't you cherry-picking a little too much? You are the strongest force here, you should take on the Hive or the Orcs, one of the guild masters countered. Right. You can leave the demonic beasts to us, another of the representatives agreed. Beeman's face darkened. It was obvious that these people just didn't want to be stuck with a place that had only one dungeon left. They were completely ignoring whether the Hive was actually the strongest faction, they simply argued based on the size of the territory. Seth on the other hand stayed silent. He watched on in slight amusement. It was a little funny to think that people had already forgotten the danger of dungeons and turned to see them as a resource. He also saw no need to speak up as things actually developed in a way that he liked. If one thing was clear to him, then that he didn't want to face that demon. The blacksmith had heard stories and read books that mentioned the danger and vindictiveness of a maestro. It wasn't that Seth was afraid to face some army of demonic beasts, but they were simply not worth the effort. His goal was for himself and his people to level up. If given the choice between a powerful and tricky enemy, and one that was just powerful and gave the same amount of experience, who would choose the difficult one? Only those idiots who didn't know what they were trying to fight. While he was watching, the first guild master had managed to form a small alliance that all argued together with him, that their guilds should take care of the demons, while the adventurer guild should face the orcs and the hive. Others saw their chance and tried to lay claim to the dungeons that had yet to be overrun by one of the four factions. When everyone was locked in a heated debate and even Beeman seemed close to losing his temper, Seth brought out ounce and played a dissonant sound that made the whole room cringe in pain and discomfort. The bard ignored their reactions and spoke. I have a simple offer. Minasmar will take on the hive, but like everyone else, we don't want to work without profit. In addition to the hive, I claim all these independent dungeons in its vicinity. With this announcement, Seth not only offered to take care of the drudgery but also demanded half the independent dungeons on the map. However, he didn't even need to use voice of Seth to have the assembled representatives agree. They had spent so much time concentrating on not being the one to face the hive, that they virtually ignored the fact that Seth asked for a hefty price for his work. They even felt happy, or crafty, that they could hamper Minasmar's profits in this place. It was almost too easy. Only Beemant showed some concern. Are you sure Minasmar can take on such a load alone? You shouldn't underestimate the hive. Taking the hive and adding the adjacent areas meant that Minasmar would be in charge of 1/3 of Floor 0. It was obvious that Beemant was worried, despite the number of people Minasmar had arrived with. Oh, don't worry. We will manage. Chapter 669 Water Scorpion's Momentum. After Seth threw a big stone into the pond, the small ripples died down and everyone soon came to an agreement. Beemant was able to dissuade most of the guilds from trying to throw themselves into their demise and concentrate on the Orc Kingdom, Kazdam. After the meeting concluded they could finally leave and rest for the night. As Seth left the hall someone grabbed his arm. Brock, the leader of the Boulder Guild, had followed him. Seth could see the worry in his eyes. It seemed that not everyone had forgotten the very real danger of dungeons. Seth, are you sure about this? I know you are strong, but if you thrust your men into this kind of situation, some of them might die. Are you prepared to lose some of them? Me? No. If you are really worried about our people, you can follow us and I will show you something fun once we reach our area. You did get some of the places along the border, didn't you? Ah, of course, you noticed. It was in case you may need some help. You know that Elsa and Marcel became chosen ones, right? I'm sure that this time we will be of help if needed. He offered his help confidently. The offer is appreciated and I will return it to you. If you find yourself in a tough spot and unwilling to sacrifice anyone, you can ask us for help. Seth knew that Brock underestimated them a little based, but he couldn't blame him. The man would soon see why Seth was so confident. Thank you, I will, Brock said with a wry smile before they walked their separate way. Seth returned to his friends to brief them on what had happened and their future course of action. Like most of the guilds, Seth and the others set off 2 days later with the Oath Guard and the Chimeras in tow. Brock and the teams of the Boulder Guild decided to travel together with them as their area was close to the border between the Orcs and the Hive. They didn't face any problems in the outer areas the guild had already cleaned, except for some solitary beasts that had probably come from the pathworks. They left these fights to the teams of Oath Guards that valiantly rode into battle. Only when they came closer to the canyon itself, did they start facing something that could be called resistance. The scar ran roughly in an east-west direction, with the territories of the Orcs and the Hive taking up almost the whole northern half. Coming from the east, the Allied force made a swerve around the Hive's territory and enter close to the border, where Minasmar intended to enter the Hive and set up their camp. However, even this resistance was only scouts and workers roaming the hills. The scouts and workers of the insects looked like giant versions of ants or termites. Their main method of fighting was their strong pincers that could break rock and their spear-like legs that could pierce stone, which allowed them to wander even across vertical surfaces. Even these weak and numerous units had levels in the early 70s and were able to match the mounted Oath Guard in a one-on-one. Too bad for them, that they didn't have the numerical advantage this time around. With the Oath Guards taking the lead, they soon reached their destination, where they would also split from the Boulder Guild. I guess this is our time to say goodbye, for now. Brock approached Seth. I have to say, seeing your Oath Guard in action really calmed me. And if you need our help, we will come. Marcel repeated Brock's promise. The man had finally gotten over Seth semi-murdering his girlfriend and returned back to his old confident self after being chosen as a champion. Ah, hearing that makes me feel glad, but don't be so quick to leave. I still have something to show you. I promised after all, the blacksmith spoke mysteriously. The blacksmith pushed back his cloak, revealing a dark armor with a red tinge covering his whole body like a carapace. He lifted his hands in the air and a massive rift opened in front of the assembled people. Out of the rift walked rows and rows of soldiers, almost 200 people, roughly a third of them wearing identical sets of silver oath armor, the rest clad in various other equipment. The audience could only watch in shock, as the army of New Faer exited Legion. I guess you understand now, why I am pretty confident to take on the hive. Seth asked smugly. After a moment of silence, Brock finally laughed. I should have known you had something planned when you sacrificed yourself to do the hard work. Now I won't feel bad to ask for help if we get into a pinch. With that, the teams of the Boulder Guild finally left, knowing they had a huge force to rely on in their back. Seth was just glad that they didn't use observation on the Fair. Despite having stats rivaling a player level 75 from the start, their levels were only in the mid-50s. Okay, let's start setting up camp. The Fair will scout the surroundings and get rid of any dangers. An hour later they had set up a camp that was not much smaller in size compared to the fort set up by the Adventurer Guild at the entrance to the Holy Land. This was largely thanks to Seth building a wall by casting the intermediate earth magic stone wall. What was originally meant to be a spell to raise a 2x2 meter slab to block an attack, had turned out to create a 4x4 meter and 50 centimeters thick wall after the effects of the giant's rod and his new equipment were added to it. They had not set up their camp on the plain outside of the canyon, where they separated with the Boulder Guild, but on a wide plateau that was at the entrance of one of the canyon's many branches. With the camp completely set up and the surrounding cleared out, they were ready to start with their plan. A day later. Next point. In a subterranean court, lit by bioluminescent mushrooms, a mantis the size of a bull stepped out from a row of advisors. New soft skins have been seen traversing our territory. The Onizopters have spotted a fortified camp not far from the greenskins, the regal-looking mantis-like monster reported. How many are there? A booming voice. There were originally almost 2 swarm companies, but they have split into 3 groups. 2 groups have been seen traveling through our territory to other places, leaving just half a company back in their camp. What is their estimated strength? At most that of an elite unit. I suggest we send 3 companies led by an elite unit to wipe out the fortified camp. The other groups won't have a place to fall back to, and we can corner them easily, the mantis explained its plan. Fine, do as you suggested. It will be enough to test their strength, the booming voice affirmed the suggestion of the aide. The monster insect in question gave a deep bow before returning to the row of other insect monster advisors. Next point. This time it was a giant, hideous water scorpion with massive appendages beside its mouth. It looked almost comical wearing the regal robe of an advisor as it was spanning tightly over its carapace. The offense of the greenskins has greatly dropped because of other groups of soft skins attacking their camps and fortifications. Instead of bothering with that little camp, I suggest we gather our forces and deal the greenskins a devastating strike, while they are distracted by the soft skins. We can just wipe out the camp on the way, it suggested with its weird appendages twitching erratically. Despite its weird antics, its voice was so charismatic that it was hard to argue against its suggestions. What do the other advisors think? The booming voice asked its court of nightmares. A majority of the assembled creatures fell into an agreeing hum, some did not, but nobody stepped up to speak against it. The mantis that had spoken first only clicked with its mandibles. Although it wanted to suggest to scout first, it had not enough convincing reasons to stop the water scorpion's momentum. What could one defiant village do in the end? Then it shall be done. Gather our forces. We will go to war on the surface. Chapter 670 Zaffin's Dream. Are you really sure about this? Monique asked hesitatingly. Although Seth had shared his strategy with them beforehand, Monique was not the only one who didn't seem confident in the plan. Only the members of the field teams and some of the core members were left in the camp. Don't forget the reason we came here for. We want to raise our levels, yes, but most importantly we want the gods to notice you. What's better to get noticed than a huge one-sided slaughter? Unlike a normal person who might have used the Oath Guards, Chimeras, and Faer to take on the huge army of the Hive and leave the surrounding smaller territories to the elite teams, Seth had sent the Oath Guards and Chimeras away, only leaving the elites of Minas Mar, and anyone currently residing in Legion. I have absolute confidence in your skills and my items. I will take care of everything, you just have to follow my lead and let loose, he said confidently. From the information the guild had shared with them, there were several encampments in the shape of termite hills distributed across the Hive's territory. Seth doubted that any of them would be able to stand up to the 3 field teams, even if they did not have legendary items. Aside from the teams, there were also Evie, her brother Edward, Allison, Ellie, Evan, and Link. Originally, Seth also wanted to bring Karina, but she had already far outgrown any of them, thanks to the constant stream of power from the hanging tree and its offshoot along the trade route. At least, he had managed to drag the gourmet hunter along. Although he had retired from dungeon action, just like Allison, they still needed to level up. Suddenly Seth lost contact with some of the scout golems he sent out earlier. Hurriedly he brought out a tablet to have a look with those closest to the ones that vanished. When the golem flew in the direction of the golem that had vanished last, Seth barely managed to have a glimpse at a massive sickle, before he lost connection to that one, too. Did something happen with the scouts? Minas asked interested from the side, seeing that Seth had brought out the tablet. I guess, they are coming to us, Seth answered her. It had been 2 peaceful days since they set up camp at the border of the insect territory. They had used the time to get familiar with the place. On their plateau, they had a 20m high wall in the back toward the hills outside the canyon. What their camp faced on the other side was a massive cliff where the land sharply dropped off into the canyon. The sight was truly something breathtaking, as if they had really entered a fantasy realm. The scar was so deep, that clouds could be occasionally seen floating between the massive stone spires and plateaus that grew out of the terrifying depths. If it wasn't for the fact that they knew that the whole region was infested with terrifying monsters, it may have actually been a nice place. With his clairvoyance, Seth was able to see some bulbous growths on the walls of the canyon with his bare eyes. These nests defended the entrances to the conquered dungeons and other subterranean sections of the insects. Seth had tried to use the golems to find all the ones in their vicinity, but he would quickly lose connection when they got deeper into the dungeon. That was why he simply places them as lookouts instead. Guys, get ready. We might get visitors real soon. 15 minutes later. Shit. In short, the roughly 30 people of Minas Mar stared into the massive canyon before them. All cliff faces were covered in a writhing mass of massive insect monsters that kept pouring from their holes and hives. What are they doing? Finn asked, a little confused. Although the canyon was chock-full with a sea of nightmarish chitin monsters, they didn't seem to come for them. It's almost as if they are ignoring us. Bulko mumbled. Wait, aren't they moving in the direction of the orc territory? Mike exclaimed. However, Mike's apt observation fell on deaf ears, as just the moment Bulko had commented, a part of the army changed course in their direction. Several hundred beasts looking like a mix of ant and spider climbed up the cliff from below, as if it was a horizontal field. The rest of the army showed no signs to even notice them. Mike's observation had not fallen on completely deaf ears, however, he quickly wished to have not said anything. These bitches dare to ignore us? Right, who do they think they are? Finn gleefully played his high P-man. What's with them throwing this ugly cannon fodder at us and just going for the dumb orcs? Right, right. We are not to be ignored, the brute cheered. Well, if that is how they want to play. Lixis, Allison, Jess. I want to see the canyon burn, don't hold back. I will support you. Make sure they understand that they can't ignore us. Yeah, the fairy roared in unbridled excitement. Okay, you can stop now. You are making me feel awkward, Finn. Okay, everyone's stomachs dropped, except Finn's. Of course, they couldn't let their targets fall into the back of their comrades, but none of them were confident facing such numbers. Only Seth seemed unimpressed. And Seth really wasn't impressed. The only thing the blacksmith cared about was showcasing their powers to the gods, or else his weeks of hard work were meaningless. How could these entertainment junkies possibly ignore this kind of battle? They were hopelessly outnumbered. There was no better hype than a turnaround against all odds. It was not his original plan, but he was going to adapt. A clear sound rang through the canyon, even making the rows upon rows of disciplined soldier insects halt for a moment. It was joined by a demonic tune and an eerie flute. A hair-raising voice soon wafted through the gorge, stitching everything together. Seth had put in some effort over the last week before the set-off and managed to raise his singing, journeyman, to leave 7, and his instrument master had finally ranked up to journeyman leave 1. Accompanied by Ounce and Gliobum, Seth played the ombos and sang to Zaphon, the burning skies. The demon's power filled the plateau, and a dark aura gathered around the 3 casters that were working together on a spell. All 3 wore one of the legendary 10 legendary magic rings. Allison's was the Ring of Koyos with the demonic enchantment of Stella's. Since she was a wizard and could use any elements, it had several effects to improve her intelligence and pure magic power without elemental inclinations. Jess wore the Torch of Hecate, a ring that could act as a magic wand and had similar powers to Seth's Cloaks of Hecate. In addition to improving the overall power of magic and fire magic especially, it had some other miscellaneous skills of Hecate and the power of cursed fire. Lixis wore the Elemental Circle, a legendary ring that could double the power of spells belonging to any of the 4 base elements, light and darkness, thanks to the materials used, the blessing of Phoebe, and demonic enchantments. Not to mention the base functions of legendary Olympian silver that doubled the power of their skills and spells. Millions of faceted eyes looked to the sky as a sudden light illuminated the canyon. Looking up to the sky, all eyes reflected a glint of horror and fascination. The skies were burning in scarlet fire. 3 witches holding hands, wearing legendary rings, enveloped in demonic power, they cast devastation. As the heavens burned, the sky started to fall and its shards set the millions that stared at it in awe aflame. The plateau they stood on towered over a sea of fire, as the canyon filled with cursed flames. Zaphan's dream, a meteor spell infused with the blessing of the demon. Ding! You have leveled up. You are now Level 73. Ding! You have leveled up. You are now Level 74. Ding! You have leveled up. You are now Level 77. Seth only got experience from playing a support role, but it was massive enough to catapult him up by 5 levels. Just how much would the casters in question have gotten? Hearing Allison of all people suddenly break out in bell-like laughter was a good indicator that their gains were massive. However, they had not much time to revel in the glory of this first strike, as the flames quickly vanished, revealing that not even a fourth of the creatures had died. Although many had been hurt, magic units among them had managed to erect barriers in time. Wiping out all of them in one strike would have been too much to ask for. Seeing so many survive actually made the bard glad. After all, everyone from Minas Mar needed a chance to shine this time around. Let's see if they can still ignore us after this. A wave of silent curses went through the members of Minas March. With the disharmonious cry of a giant cricket, they saw the whole swarm change direction for the plateau, which suddenly seemed like a tiny nutshell swimming on a raging sea of nightmarish bugs. It reminded Seth of a scene from the movie Spacecraft Squad Dies. If the blacksmith was completely honest, he had not expected things to massively escalate to this sort of scale. But there was no backing out now. Attack. Chapter 671 Spiders. Oh God, are they serious? Clay, a scout from the Boulder Guild, exclaimed in horror when he finally reached the place. They had seen the scarlet meteors falling from kilometers away and he had rushed here at Brock's command, to find out what was going on. The scene he witnessed was incomprehensible. There was a sea of nightmarish limbs and eyes, so many creatures it was hard to see where one began and another ended. Like an enraged force of nature, the whole ocean was rushing toward a small plateau, where not even 30 people waited to face them with a fortress and a cliff in their back. Attack! He heard the roar of Minas Mar's Tower Master and they attacked. There was no formation, strategy, or party play, people individually rushed into the sea of insects climbing onto the plateau as if they were looking to die. Except, they didn't. Like a shoal of fish avoiding a turtle, each person split the sea, leaving a trail of blood in their wake. He didn't know where to look, as no matter where he looked, he had a hard time understanding what he saw. There were several people just weaving through the masses of enemies, leaving a gruesome trail of innards and bodies in their wake. A tigerman followed by a hideous familiar, as he logged his enemy with a mighty axe as if they were a grove of young saplings. Splitting the giant armored beasts like firewood, it seemed like his speed just kept increasing. Between these cyclones of destruction there were random explosions among the approaching insects as if they triggered landmines. At one point he caught a glimpse of something like a rune lighting up, just before the area turned into a toxic bog that swallowed several of the beasts. The mages of both camps were fighting their own back and forth, as spells of all elements rampaged across the battlefield and tried to break each other's shields. Let the heavens rage, a voice thundered across the battlefield and a cloud formed above the canyon. A storm of lightning bolts rained from the cloud, breaking barriers and exploding the cliff sides. Many fell to their death as they fell with the debris. In a chaotic slaughter, Minas Mar's vanguard soon secured the whole edge of the plateau, turning any bug glimpsing over the edge into a rain of body fluids and parts that hit their comrades below. With the barrier temporarily broken by the thunderstorm, the rearguard of Minas Mar also managed to pick off most of the beasts that crawled across the cliff faces. Clay had watched on in shock for less than half an hour, but Minas Mar had managed to turn the tide from what looked like a suicide mission, to an advantageous position to farm experience. However, this didn't hold for long. A dissonant cricket noise sounded again and the whole army still visible suddenly retreat back into their holes and down into the mist of the canyon below. Cinema Dimension. You really managed to set quite the stage, but aren't they giving up a little too easily, the bearded blacksmith god whispered to the god of chaos sitting beside him. They had prepared well for this day. The cinema was changed to the shape of a Greek theater, with the display being a massive orb in the middle showing the scene of the canyon. All seats were filled to the brim with figures of gods. But the best seats were taken up by prominent faces of regulars in the dimension. Hades, Persephone, Seth, Hephaestus, Hermes, and Apollo, they were all sitting close to the front, enjoying the show. Hard to overlook were also the system god and the dungeon god, seated in the same row. Other gods were more secretive about their activities, hiding their faces as they watched the spectacle. With the beginning of the Age of Gods, Earth had become a popular source of entertainment. There was a high demand for quality programs. Many gods used to look for potential champions instead of arduously zapping through the channels or rankings. Even when they didn't have intentions to choose a champion or give a blessing, many wanted to watch. Oh, don't worry. This was simply the first wave. They realized that the speck of dirt they tried to wipe is more obstinate than expected. This wasn't a signal for retreat. It's the signal for the big guns, the god of destruction said with a self-satisfied smile. Things were only going to become more interesting from now on. It had to. While Seth set the stage, the others had put in some effort to assemble this crowd to help their little champion in his endeavor. They had invited a lot of gods and even went as far as to give discounts to fill the room with potential patrons for the Lords of Minas March. All they had to do now was deliver a good show. A sudden silence reigned over the canyon, as the army had actually pulled back. Jonah stood at the edge of the cliff, vigilantly looking down into the abyss. He saw a glint in the darkness, but before he could react, a loud clang rang over the plateau. Glittering pieces spun through the air and the left side of his face exploded in a burning pain. It felt like half his face was missing. Gah! He cried out and hurriedly stumbled back from the edge. Taking a deep breath, he concentrated and used some of the energy in the hungry coin to regenerate his eyeball in a breath. He heard a whoosh which was followed by another clank that echoed across the plateau like a signal. Jonah had managed to react just in time to block an attack with the angel sword. The first thing his newly generated eye saw were the venom-oozing fangs of something Jonah could only label a spider for lack of a better name. It was a deformed spider with a distantly humanoid upper body using 4 legs as arms and the other 4 as legs. Its whole body was covered in a coat of glistening bristles. It made an awful gushing noise when speaking. Ho ho, you have not only survived the general's sniper bristle shot but even blocked my surprise attack. You are not bad, soft skin. Jonah looked at couldn't care less about the praise of the beast. He was staring at the pieces of his shattered mask on the ground. A face more handsome and pretty than even that of a movie star was revealed to the world. The blood covering half his was could not diminish his beauty. On the contrary, it gave his look something wild, with the crimson blood contrasting his pale, smooth as jade skin. I have to admit, you are really pretty for a soft skin. The spider let slip, but it fell silent when its 4 pairs of eyes met the one of the vampiric swordsman. There was murder in these eyes, more terrifying than any mask. The atmosphere of this lovely, supple face had quickly toppled, looking like a porcelain death mask. It made the tarantula immediately take a defensive stance with its chitin spear, but it was already too late. Ugh! Its spear barely managed to block the lightning-fast strike of the macabre sword, but the human suddenly plunged his claw-like hand into its abdomen. Warm, yellowish body fluid spewed out from the wound and covered Jonah. Ha! Don't think this would be enough to kill me. I'm an elite of the Emperor's army. I will never fall to a mere soft skin, it gushed enraged and flung away the sword that was locked with his spear. With a mighty roar, it shot all the bristles on its body, turning the swordsman into a porcupine. Ha ha! All my bristles are venomous. You will die soon. Ignoring the bristles, Jonah had swung his sword before the spider even finished its attack, severing its head in a clean move. He grunted unhappily as he pulled out one of the bristles. Jonah really liked his armor made from newt leather as it tremendously increased his health, but it had not enough defense to completely stop the bristles. It was now full of holes. Even his mask was broken. Hearing the sound of battle, he quickly pulled himself together. Everyone was fighting some weird giant insects. This wasn't the time to mourn his items, he had to help the others. But just as he attempted to rush off, he saw himself forced to dodge another attack and jump back several steps. Earth Spider Leave 90, Elite. More of the spiders climbed the edge, and they were not the only ones that came with company. Everywhere on the plateau, more of these elite monsters appeared. As much as he wanted to help, maybe he was the one that needed it more. Jonah grit his teeth. Taking control of the sword with telekinesis, he got into his combat stance as a blood monk. With a handsome but grim face, he threw himself into the battle. Chapter 672 soldiers stand. Things turned when hundreds of elite monsters appeared at the plateau. Their reign of undisputed superiority at the edge of the cliff was broken and the field was slowly filling with an army of elite insects. Nosoderma Leave 91, Elite. Mina fell back under the onslaught of a group of weird insects with thick armor and earth skills. She wasn't in much danger, but she took a lot of time to kill them, despite primal rage and strategist's mentality. Their defense was so tough that it took her many attacks just to kill one. To get through their thick skin in the middle of the fight, she had to keep striking the same place with a combination of shadow magic and her shard of biting ice to shatter the shell. Even ice field and cursed ice could only slow them down. The cat girl regretted having not enough time to get acquainted with her engagement rings, as using Nyx or Erebus still felt unnatural to her and she had been unable to incorporate their advantages into her fighting style. She could use the ice skill and blessing of Andras to slow them, but there were too many to concentrate on killing one at the time. The shadow assassin pulled back to see if she could switch enemies with someone else, but the whole battlefield was in chaos with the other vanguard slowly retreating back to the fort. She was on the way back, too, when a sudden sound made her halt in place. Some distance away she could also see her brother, Mike, similarly standing still. The rhythm of the anvil swelled and even the hordes of the hive came to a standstill, as the demonic lyre joined in. A choir echoed through the canyon and the sickly orange light of the Holy Land dimmed. Looking above, Mina found a cathedral made of jarring blue light had blocked the sky and covered the plateau. She found herself standing frozen stiff until a deep, demonic voice thundered across the army. It took a moment for the words to take on shape in her mind. She didn't know what they said, but they understood what they meant. Soldiers stand. From all around the world, waiting, to hear the battle cry, gathered here, victory is near. Sound will fill the hall, bringing power to us all. A blazing blue halo enveloped everyone on the battlefield and Mina could feel a strength fill her body and an urge growing in her hands. We alone. Fighting a battle that is true. Own the right to live the fight. Mina felt the power growing and with it an overpowering emotion of duty and bloodlust. While the halo on the monsters was extinguished, the one around the member of Minasmar blazed stronger. We're here for all of you. Now swear the blood upon your steel will never dry. Stand and fight together beneath the battle sky. Suddenly she raised her weapon in the air and joined in on the choir of Mina's march. We are warriors. Warriors of the world. Dark light fell from the cathedral ceiling, like a blessing, onto all members who sang the choir. The power flooded her mind with wrath and inspiration and she naturally threw herself into the fight, using her skills in ways she had not yet explored. To bring them all destruction, suffering, and pain. We are the hammer of the gods, we are thunder, wind, and rain. Erebus. Almost a third of the plateau vanished in a dark sphere. Mina's approach completely changed from her original style as an assassin and more like a shadow mage. Inside the sphere, she was just another shadow without a body, merged with the darkness. Instead of attacking with her daggers, she only cast shadow blades that cost her almost nothing in this state. As the elite monsters tumbled in the darkness, they were attacked by thousands of blades that came from all angles. It didn't matter that only a few managed to break their shells and armor as they soon suffered the powers of the offspring of darkness. Some turned into decrepit old creatures with fragile shells and little power, others died instantly, or fell into a deep slumber, unable to even register their death by 1,000 cuts. More stood in shock or shame, suffered self-pity, or went berserk against their own people. All the while others like Mike, Phaenis, and Finn were able to see in her darkness and had also fallen into a battle frenzy. The fairy's swarm of frost moths was constantly growing, drowning the enemies as her fist kept pounding like a jackhammer. Phaenis Yatagon constantly changed shape and traveled unconventional paths to strike the wound cut by Mina's shadow blades, causing terrifying status effects all over the place. Mike turned into a brute, headbutting monsters into oblivion, just as often as burning them down with his sword. His fighting style became a lot more erratic and brutal as he started incorporating successive headbutts into his fighting style. Similar scenes happened all across the plateau as the members of Minasmar started to quickly incorporate the power of their legendary items into their fighting styles. With a burst of manic laughter, Azul stopped focusing on spells and jumped into melee combat. She used the demonic lightning. With her peal of manic cackle she fried anyone that dared to step in front of the spear. She was accompanied by James, who covered her back like a guard dog and easily deflected anyone who got too close. Another part of the field was filled with raging flames, none of which were Seth's fault. Edward and Jess were raging in that place, turning it into a hell with a combination of white hilt of Ixion and a constant barrage of fire spells. Other places were plagued by curses from Ray the Shaman and Evie, water/ice magic from Shay, and the manic slaughterers like Dohu, Lydia, Monique, and Jonah. All supported by Bulko, and Ferdinand, the only priests, and a constant stream of elemental arrows that sowed discord among the enemies. The only mage still firmly standing on the walls of the camp was Allison, her lips rapidly moving as she constructed a massive spell. A giant magic circle took shape in the sky above the plateau, weakening or outright blocking enemy magic. Under the support of the spectral cathedral above them, they fell into an explosive charge, pushing the limits of their skill and reaping lives. The initiative was again on the side of Minasmar, and the elites started to show panic, as they were faced with an overwhelming rampage. There they wait in fear with swords in feeble hands. With dreams to be a king, first one should be a man. I call about and charge them all with a life that is a lie. A sickly dark aura now also enveloped the insect, and another verse of diabolic lyrics crept into their ears. And in their final hour, they shall confess before they die. Everyone immediately noticed a rapid change as about half of the enemy left became slower as if tied down by a heavy burden. Nobody asked twice, and the elites of Minasmar jumped on the weakened enemy like hungry wolves. Good work. I'm impressed. Ounce praised the bard. Seth took a deep breath and let out a sigh of relief. When he saw everyone retreating, he realized that he may have been a little too overconfident. After belching out the last verses, he had to sit down and take a short break. He was just glad he didn't have to keep the song up for long to change the tide this time. The situation was mostly decided. Although the effects of the ballad would slowly wear off, the memory of how they used their skill would stay with them. His throat felt sore and his mana and willpower were about half exhausted, but he had succeeded in not just singing, but also playing an epic-rated piece. He wasn't sure at the start, but the ballad had actually to turn the situation without stepping in himself or using the golems. Thank you. Thanks for teaching me. Hey, this is all on you. To be able to succeed in a work of man-o-or is a sign of the effort you put into it. Seth looked across the battlefield. Seeing the others getting rid of the last remnants, he felt confident enough to take a look at his status. In shock, he saw that his level had jumped all the way to 85 with the experience he got from acting as a support. With the previous point, he now had 133 attribute points and 12 skill points. He also checked his skills. He had heard a notification about the system quest, but he didn't have the time to pay attention to it. After checking for a moment, he finally found what had changed. For one, he had a new skill. Active skill, Seed of Hades, 10,000 mana, no cooldown. Hades used the seeds of pomegranates to tie his wife to himself. This way Persephone would spend half a year with him in the underworld and half a year with her mother on Mount Olympus. If you capture a soul and find its original body, you can reforge their bond and bring them back to life as your subordinate. They will have all the power and potential they originally had in life, but can only leave your domain for half a year, before needing to return. If they fail to return in time, their life is null and they will return to a corpse for good. This was massive. It was a true resurrection skill, kind of. It was arguable whether this was better than just using his own method of resurrection as a Fae or when it came to raw power. But Seth could imagine that their intellect and memory would be more complete if he used this skill. It took a little longer to find the second change that was unlocked with Leave 80's systems quest. A small tick beside his infernal scald, unique, in his status. He had unlocked the job advancement for his second job. He was just about to check what his option were when a massive tremor shook the plateau below their feet. Chapter 673 Lydia. Seth looked up, staring directly at the emergence of a kaiju from the opposite canyon wall. He instinctively activates the appraisal skill. Grillitalpa General Leave 97, Boss. As the cliff collapsed and massive boulders fell into the rift between them, other figures jumped from the dust cloud and landed on the plateau. It seemed that the hive was not ready to watch silently as the empowered soft skins slaughtered their elites. Lucanity General Leave 94, Boss. Lycocity General Leave 95, Boss. The two tallest beasts, standing at least 10 meters tall, were immediately picked up by observation and his heart dropped a little. Both of them were girthy beetles, one with a massive horn, and the other with a giant pincer head that emerged from the cloud. Two bosses above Leave 90. And the other ones wouldn't be any weaker. This time Seth really started to worry. The elites were no big problems after the power-up with the ballad, but the buff was wearing off and a boss was usually between 20 to 40 levels stronger than their actual level. Minasmar's field teams would have a problem taking down one of them, but Seth had seen at least 5 and they only had 3 established parties. But still, with their legendary items, they should. Whomp! He was still processing when something crashed into the camp's wall below. James, he recognized the off-tank that had just become embedded into the wall of their fort. Experience the full power of the dark side, he heard in the distance before he also saw the 4-armed figure of Azul rushing back. In the meantime, Ferdinand, the healer of Monique's team, had already cast a heal on James. Damn it! Seth formed his resolve to signal to retreat and reassemble. Even if the parties could take them on, they were currently all spread out because of their rush into the enemy horde. Seth couldn't allow for them to get picked off one by one. Not all of them had items that allowed them to face overwhelmingly strong enemies without a party. But it wasn't like the enemy was standing by idly. Before Seth could smack the anvil to sound a signal, a slim, agile beast charged at Azul mere moments after she came into view. Vespani General Leave 96, boss. Pursuing the lightning mage was a child-sized and almost humanoid-looking beast with bright black and yellow stripes and spindly limbs. The appearance was deceiving. It was extremely fast and lashed out with its weak-looking claws the moment it caught up with Azul. Not a moment too late, Tekker, who was defending the base until now, used one of his skills that allowed him to switch places with an ally. The moment the small claw smashed into the tall shield and barrier the tank had cast, a shock wave raced over the plateau and blew away the dust cloud. Finally, Seth could see the battlefield clearly and found everyone either locked in combat. His face grimaced. There were 8 bosses above level 90. Although nobody died immediately, it was obvious that everyone locked in combat, not Monique, was having a hard time just surviving. Jonah was holding back a hideous beast with a thick carapace and wielding a massive spiked club. Ray and Shay, the shaman and mage brothers, were slowly retreating while supporting him with magic from behind. Stenopal General Leave 92, boss. However, their magic seemed to have only little effect against the beast. It seemed to have a high magic resistance. Although they seemed to be struggling, it seemed fine for now. Monique on the other hand was locked into a duel with something like a buff-looking mantis that held its sickles like dual sabers. Using Tatzel's sacrifice, Monique seemed to be faring a lot better against her opponent, despite facing the one with the highest level so far. Mantodia General Leave 98, boss. However, it had obviously met the worst match, as its double sabers were unable to land a blow against Monique's defensive spear moves. On the contrary, the spear demon's sharp stabs that were mixed in and aimed at the insect opening were only countered by the beast's speed and quick reaction. In the flaming field, where Edward and Jess had raised hell on earth, Evie's brother was facing the giant rhinoceros beetle warrior. Although Edward was surviving, he had a bad matchup, as the bug's thick armor seemed very resistant to being set on fire. Mina, Mike, Fianus, and Finn were lucky as they had been fighting under the cover of the night so far and the dome had yet to vanish. The giant stag beetle warrior and a variation of an arachne had charged into the dome of darkness. Dynastini General Leave 95, boss. Despite facing 2 opponents, they were in no danger thanks to the cover of darkness. Instead of fighting a desperate fight, the group of 4 had used the cover of darkness to reassemble and focus on the Dynastini General. The beast looked like a furry 4-armed arachne and stood roughly 5 meters tall. The boss was swinging around a massive halberd that looked like it was crudely shaped from a kind of crystalline metal. Every swing created strong gales and massive walls of wind she used to block an attack. Despite fighting in absolute darkness, she was able to defend herself against the combined onslaught of Finn, Mike, Mina, and Fianus. It was hard to fathom how such a massive and clumsy-looking beast was able to accurately dodge Mina's shadow blades and use her range advantage to fight the other 3. Not only was the spider boss agile beyond belief, she also managed to weave web attacks into her swing with the halberd. The combined wind and crowd control made it especially hard for Finn. The little fairy was specialized in extreme speed and melee damage, but the wind and halberd kept her at distance, while she had to constantly look out for the webs that could slow and even immobilize her. Although the general put some pressure on their group, both sides fought to a standstill. Probably the worst off with their enemy were Dohu and Lydia. The tiger and assassin found themselves close to each other when a tank barreled into them. It was a black, diabolic beetle about 3 meters tall and covered in metallic black armor plates. Even the axe of Polytechnus and Lydia's new dagger had a hard time just scratching the armor. It probably had a similar defense as Tekker. No Soderma General Leave 96, boss. Seth hesitated. He feared for their lives but was also apprehensive to immediately help them. Everything was tilting towards the hive once again, but things were not hopeless. This was their chance, the ultimate struggle. It was the perfect moment. There was a sudden change as a hair-raising screech echoed across the battlefield. The Nosoderma general was suddenly missing part of its front limb that had fallen to the ground. It was slashed off by a hairy beast, and it was not Dohu. Opposite the tigerman now stood an anthropomorphic wolf a head taller than himself, who wasn't short at all. The wolf had dark silver fur that glowed in a bluish sheen and wielded a pair of daggers. It also wore the armor of Mina's march. Lydia! The wolf roared and kicked the tiger out of the way, just in time to evade the attack of the enraged armor beetle. Although it had lost a limb, it was only angrier. You will pay for harming my beautiful self, it roared, speaking for the first time. You preposterous firkins! Die! It had only become angrier and entered a rage mode as a dark aura enveloped the iron beetle. The lost claw quickly regenerated and he peppered the world in attacks. However, Lydia in her new wolf form had gotten a massive boost to all physical attributes and senses. She managed to parry all attacks with her pair of legendary daggers. One was the still hard-to-appraise dagger made of an angel, the other was the Knight of the Danaides, enchanted with the fate of the Danaides, which gave the dagger a massive mana burn and bleeding effect. Although the mana burn was doing its work, it was a shame that none of the bleeding effects on the blade had a chance to work, as insects had some natural resistance to bleeding because of their different body structure. Doha quickly got up and started cooperating with the transformed Lydia. Her stats had improved a lot, but the fight still didn't become easier. Despite it losing its mana, the beast did not become any weaker, as it heavily relied on physical stats and its armor. It also wasn't like every attack of Lydia was able to penetrate the thick carapace. They needed to come up with a strategy and bide their time. But finally being able to fight on even ground, gave the tiger hope that they would be able to overcome this hurdle. Lydia's dagger. Knight of the Danaides. Legendary. Physical damage, 2250. Durability, 5000. 1 dark magic is 150% more destructive. 2 plus 200% physical damage. 3 will absorb blood to repair and strengthen itself. 4 will absorb part of the target's blood to heal and strengthen the user. 5 plus 120 agility. 6 fate of the Danaides, strong burst of mana burn. 7 active skill, lacerate. 8 active skill, Danaides deed, 75% chance to cause a long bleeding dot. 9 passive skill, canine instincts. 10 passive skill, agility of the jackal. A dagger made by Master Smith, the first master blacksmith of Earth, and enchanted by Master Smith, the first master enchanter of Earth. Focused on high-speed combat, the dagger combines the agility and spirit of a jackal with crippling effects using divine, demonic and mysterious means. Any assassin would work to earn this dagger. Chapter 674 Help grew low. Finn's battle. She had no idea what the situation looked like on the rest of the battlefield, but it was embarrassing for Finn how much they were struggling with a single boss. As the fight went on and they couldn't really deal any damage to the Dynastini general, her frustration grew. The giant, hairy spider lady kept dodging or blocking their attack by swinging her club-like halberd around. The fairy was getting sick of being swung around by the gales she created with her attacks. Although she got little to no damage, her swarm of frost moths was already gone, and she had hardly any chance to get a hit in and summon more. Mina, Mike, and Phaenis were not much better off. Although Mike managed to combine the elemental properties of his fire sword and frost armor to deal some AoE damage, his legendary helmet was almost useless as any of his charges were interrupted or avoided. Phaenis on the other hand was able to break out into bursts of speed and deal some damage, but it was nothing that gave them a great edge over the Dynastini general. Their party was not balanced enough to take on a boss like this. Without a ranged attacker or mage, they lacked a way to deal constant damage. Suddenly she felt a resistance when she tried to take a stance and charge at the spider again. Not again, she thought to herself annoyed. A tough, slightly stretchy thread had stuck itself to her again. The almost invisible threads did no damage, but they were a massive pain in the butt to get rid of and kept hindering her movements. Looking up, she happened to see that Mike was also covered in the sticky mess, but he was much closer to the spider boss than her. In the moment the party saw that he was in a calamitous position, the general had already moved. The crude spike in the back of the halberd penetrated Mike's frozen sky brigandine. With a gush of blood, he was catapulted into the distance. She could only watch it happen, unable to help Mike. She only saw Mike lying lifelessly on the floor. Finn's heart dropped and she felt like she was falling into a hole. At this moment, she felt powerless and helpless, and it reminded her of the darkest moment of her life. Back then, when they opened the portal and a massive flood of water washed through their teleport hub. Tens of people screamed in panic as they were swept away by the dreadful element and the feeling of being unable to fight the torrent that carried them to Earth. "Do you want strength?" an upbeat voice asked the terror-stricken fairy. "The ability to protect and save what you hold dear with iron fists." It was a warm male voice that carried a smile in its tone. The little brute suddenly realized that she stood in a vast dark void. She had not noticed when her surroundings changed. "Who are you?" she asked warily. Instead of answering with words, there was a rush of impressions that flooded her mind, which helped her understand who and what she was dealing with. The warmth of a hearth fire, the softness of a bed. The joy of dancing, drinking, and eating. Overwhelming power when protecting what is held dear and precious. "Do you accept?" "Yes, Dwarf Grandpa." From a short deep, Seth's mood was on the rise again. He didn't know what exactly happened to Lydia, whether she got a blessing or became a chosen, but their fight was not the only one undergoing changes. Jonah, who was locked in a difficult duel with the Stenopal general, was suddenly tinged in sanguine light as clear, yellow, and green fluids rose from the ground and started circulating him in concentric rings. Tears of blood flowed down his perfect cheeks as he seemed to experience a feeling of profound sadness, a scene that would rend anyone's heart. Did he always look this handsome? Seth could not help but doubt his memory, looking at Jonah now. Blood ribbons moved with every one of his movements, cutting into the boss bug. Jonah pranced around the beast in an elegant manner. It was menacing to watch but almost charming in a way. Seth couldn't help but smirk. Whatever God chose Jonah, the man in question was probably dying inside right now. However, his mood dropped to the floor, when Seth saw Mike getting flung away. But before he could react, several things happened simultaneously. Finn exploded in an aura of golden flames as she entered her melee queen mode in unprecedented force. Mina let out the roar of a predator and outright vanished from his sight. Mike, the man in the center of the tragedy, answered her lion's roar as he jumped back on his feet and grew by 3 feet, now looking much closer to a lion Tija than a beastman. He was enveloped in a golden light and the chest wound healed at a visible rate. Was it Finn's skill? The next moment Mina appeared again was accompanied by the spider's painful screeches. The Dynastini general was missing 2 of her hind legs and part of her bulbous buttocks. She seemed to be about to charge again when the duration of the field of darkness created by Nyx finally wore off. Seeing Mike back on his feet, she seemed to calm down and joined the others to re-evaluate the situation. Finally, the Lucanidi general, the almost 10-meter tall stag beetle warrior, was finally able to see and quickly rushed to the spider's help. Mike, Mina, and Finn were enveloped in powerful auras. There was no doubt they could take on one boss. However, while the 3 seemed to have gained strength, it was Phaenis that overshadowed them as she finally awoke from her stupor. The mountain brigand was suddenly enveloped in a menacing aura of utter threat and killing intent. Not only could Seth feel it from all the way back in the camp, both bosses and her 3 teammates instinctively backed away from her. A whimsical wind grew around her and brought with it the sound of battle and woes of the dying. In the next moment, she charged at the giant beetle warrior. The yatagan, extended to the length of a longsword, was shining brightly in the orange light of the Holy Land. Her movement seemed slow to the eyes, but it only lent itself to increasing the feeling of impending doom emanating from her blade. The stag beetle general managed to barely react in time and took a defensive position with his crude shield, only to fall for a feint, and receive several cuts across his body not covered by the shield. The wounds immediately started to rot. While the other 3 dominated the spider, even without the shadow domain, the course of her fight only kept becoming more and more bizarre. The beetle warrior was constantly on the retreat, but at points, it seemed like he deliberately dodged into attacks. The beginning of the end was when Phaenis made a slash that would obviously miss, but the general moved into the attack's path and had one of his legs chopped off. He fell to the ground, where he took a defensive position, trusting in his thick carapace. But the moment the brigand made a move, he suddenly rolled over, completely exposing his chest to her stab. At the same time, the other 3 had also put pressure on the spider general. "No. Bob." Seemingly seeing the stag beetle lose like this, prompted a silent observer to finally react. With a deep, echoing roar that shocked the whole canyon, the giant beast on the opposite cliff started to pull itself out from the rock. Grillatalpa General Leave 97, boss. The giant monster that had broken through the cliff and brought the generals into the fight was attempting to come to their help, now that the situation was turning again. It only had the 2nd highest level, but its body size alone meant that it was probably the strongest general in attendance. However, the moment it started moving, a clear sound answered its roar. The whole plateau shook and all fights paused as everyone's head suddenly turned to the gorge between the plateau and the cliff with the giant insect. Breaking from the hard rock of the canyon like it was water, was a humongous snake that directly charged into the massive beetle, beating it back into the cliffside where it came from. Both giant beasts vanished into the earth, but the whole canyon kept rocking from earthquakes. Everything had been going really well. There were already several people that had gained the favor of deities. There was no way Seth couldn't allow that beast to shake the delicate balance between tension and safety. He was forced to step in and give Python the signal to take care of the Grulatalpa general. He did that through telepathy. Playing the anvil was only for the atmosphere. Now, the fights could continue with their high-quality tension. Was what the blacksmith hoped, but his hopes were dashed. Retreat? Help Grullo. Seeing their biggest force get pushed back like that had the generals finally make a decision. The tide of the battle had already turned with some of the members of Minasmar gaining divine powers. Facing this danger, they decided to turn back and try to retreat. The Dynastini general exploded in a storm of bristles, leaving her naked, but it was enough distraction for her to grab the fallen stag beetle and use an item to flee. In a similar way, most of the generals managed to flee in a flash of light, not dissimilar to a player's home call. Only one general left their body on the battlefield. The moment the Mantidi general fell back to use the escape skill, he was unceremoniously pinned to the ground by a spear covered in a blazing silver aura. Chapter 675 Cover Yourself. Cinema Dimension. Kek kek kek, who would have thought that Olympus would steal us the show like this, a jolly voice chortled. That aura. It's you. What are you doing here? Seth suddenly jumped from his seat and looked at the hooded figure in the second row to the right. Haha. It has been me all along. The figure flung away its robe and revealed that it had been a dwarf standing on the seat all along. A pot-bellied midget, with jiggling man boobs and an ugly lion head, cackled happily as he exposed the whole dimension to his full frontal nudity. Bess, the god of chaos, exclaimed. It was the first time the always laid-back Seth seemed genuinely upset. My. I know we had our differences, but you should really get over it. Especially when we might meet each other more often in the future. I just chose a really cute little champion, Bess said with a wide, happy grin. If it isn't Bess, the defender of everything good and the enemy of all that is bad. Please wear something appropriate, Hades scolded the dwarf unfazed. You are still a party pooper. Although he complained, the Protector Holmes followed the request of the god of the underworld and wore a shendit, covering the unspeakable once again. Happy. Moderately. Calm down, Seth. It's not you had that big of a feud. Although the god of destruction seemed unreconciled, he shrugged and sat down without saying a word. Bess only grinned and sat back down among the other deities from Heliopolis that had come to watch at Seth's invitation. Not everyone was paying attention to the bickering of the Egyptian gods. As Bess had mentioned, Olympus had stolen their show. Hephaestus had only eyes for a single figure in the room roughly opposite his seat. The face could change, the stature could change, but he would recognize her clear, grey eyes anywhere. Eyes emitting intelligence, excellent and a hint of superiority, without seeming haughty or cold. Their eyes met. Athena. He whispered with bittersweet pain in his voice. She looked away, but there was just the slightest hint of a blush on her cheeks. She wasn't the only Olympian that had stepped in, on this fight. Athena, Phobos, why are you guys hiding in the crowd? We are family, you should sit with us, Apollo took the word. 2 seats appeared, one between himself and Hephaestus and one beside Hermes. His gesture made it clear that he intended for Athena to sit beside Hephaestus. The goddess of wisdom's cool facade showed just a hint of being troubled for a duration of time only a god could pick up on. She sighed and came over, sitting down between Apollo and Hephaestus. Hello, Hephaestus. Apollo and Hermes, she greeted them with a nod. A moment later, Hermes suddenly appeared behind someone and pulled down their hood. It revealed an Olympian helmet that hid the face of the figure in the darkness. He was slightly shaking and didn't seem to notice that his hood came off. You know, brother, Apollo spoke to you. You should stop laughing to yourself all creepily and sit with us, Phobos. You, Uncle Hermes. I'm sorry, Uncle Apollo, he apologized, surprisingly flustered. No need, you just picked up a very compatible champion. I can understand that you are happy, Apollo said with an amicable smile. Stop standing around and sit down already, Hades said with a scowl. Why yes, great uncle. Ding. An item you made has become a special item. +1 to all attributes. Just after the battle, Seth got 2 notifications but he ignored them and rushed over to Mike. The almost 3-meter-tall anthropomorphic lion was breathing heavily. Mike, are you okay? He asked his soon-to-be brother-in-law. The lion couldn't answer as a wolf, almost as tall as himself, jumped at him and hugged his neck in tears, repeating his name over and over. Seth backed off. Mike seemed to be okay and the two hairy lovers deserved some time to deal with their feeling among themselves. The blacksmith did the only sensible thing and went over to soothe Mina, who had just witnessed her brother almost die. The cat had held herself together until the fight was over. Now that the target for her anger has fled, she completely unraveled in his arms. This is your fault, she finally sobbed after a while. If you... Seth hugged her tightly, interrupting her. Yes, I'm sorry. It's my fault. I was wrong. I didn't expect things to turn out this way and I should have stepped in earlier. Why you should have? I should have. She just needed a place to unload her sorrows and Seth willingly took it, hugging her tightly while she drenched his chest in tears, and a little bit of snot. He also decided to apologize to the others, later. He thought it was necessary, but he had overestimated the danger of the hive and their speed of action. In his attempt to strengthen everyone, he had led them into unforeseen danger. Finn, I'm also sorry to have put you into this situation, he said when Mina had calmed a little. Nghi, it's fine. Finn is fine, the fairy insisted with an awkward smile. However, Seth saw right through her facade. Finn had spent over a year with Yule Cat's fur. Seeing Mike hurt like that had hit her almost as hard as Mina. No need to hold back, Finn, come here. He's right, just let it out, Mina added with an encouraging smile. Hearing this, Finn's dams broke and she rushed into Mina's and Seth's embrace, crying really unsightly. It's my fault. Finn, I couldn't help Mike even when I saw it happen, she wept. I wasn't strong enough, Finn couldn't help anyone again. It's okay, nobody blames you. Yes, it's not your fault, Finn. Look, Mike is completely fine now, already back to flirting with Lydia. Finn noisily sniffed back her snot. What do you mean? That giant doggy is Lydia. Well, you weren't the only ones that had stuff happen. Slowly the members of Minasmar assembled around Seth, Mina, and Finn that held each other in their arms. With Mike and Lydia, beside Tohu, Minasmar kept growing hairier. It was a relief when the two soon shrank back down to their human appearances. When everyone calmed down, the teams returned to camp, to sort out what had happened today, while the fair took over to process the corpses that piled up on the plateau. Some had become chosen ones, others had gained strong blessings. The difference when it came to one's status was in the class. A blessing granted additional skills and attributes, becoming a chosen one would do the same and more. It would change one of the two classes a player could have and grant them part of the divine power of the god. Among the member of Minasmar, Lydia, Phaenis, Jonah, Finn, and surprisingly Archer had become chosen ones. Mina, Mike, and Monique had only gained blessings. Now, this didn't mean that blessings were worth less, as one could gain multiple blessings and a blessing could be a god's way to call dibs on a player. Of these 8, Lydia and Mike had gained the powers with the most obvious changes. Well, I gained the blessing of a god called Mahi's. I still don't quite have the hang of it, but it allowed me to take on Lord Mahi's likeness, which raises my physical prowess and combat abilities. At the same time, it says I gain some control over fire, wind, and water. It's similar for me. I became the chosen of WebNovel. It changed by second class into Trailblazer, which slightly improves my ability to see, detect, set, and defuse traps, and I gained WebNovel's mastery of club and bow. In addition, I can also take on his likeness to improve my overall combat power. It says I would greatly boost the skills of my second class if I take on the god's shape. On that note, I may need new weapons to make use of these skills, she said with a cheeky smile, looking at the blacksmith expectantly. Seth just ignored her stare. He wasn't the giving tree, but for some reason, Lydia's grin only became cheekier. You see, actually, I didn't just gain skills. Lord WebNovel also gave me these and said to find a blacksmith that could make divine weapons from it, she said triumphantly and pulled out a bar of copper-colored metal, a bundle of white string, and a piece of timber from her inventory. You know, I could also. She wanted to tease him, but Seth had already snatched the bar from her hands. Now we are talking. We can speak about the kind of weapon later, he said while naturally stashing away the bar of special material in his own inventory. It followed an awkward silence that was broken by Finn. Finn became the chosen of a funny dwarf called Bess. He has a really big potbelly and bigger boobies than Finn. A different kind of awkward silence followed Finn's statement. Chapter 676 Divine Powers. Finn happily described her experience with Bess and the powers she gained. Her primary class of battle cleric had changed to Guardian Twerp, which improved her skills in melee combat, protection, and healing. Finn now also has an incredible way to constantly increase my power, she boasted proudly. It seemed she was already back to her usual self. When asked what that way was, the fairy took a deep breath to talk about it but stopped mid-sentence with a little blush. It's a little embarrassing, so Finn would rather not talk about it. Something Finn was not comfortable talking about. Everyone was shocked. Finn, if it's something weird, or uncomfortable, you don't have to do it, everyone reassured her, just making her look even more uncomfortable. Facing the group's encouragement, Finn became more and more flustered. Stop, please. It's really nothing weird. It's just. I can grow stronger by having fun and celebrating. I didn't want to tell you for your own sake, she finally exclaimed. She added the last sentence when she saw the dismayed faces of everyone around. Other people had to work hard, but the fairy had to go out and have fun. How was that fair? However, a burst of roaring laughter quickly lightened the mood. Isn't that great? We will have to celebrate a lot more when we get back home then. Everyone wins. Seth laughed happily. There was no celebrating alone. Of course, they all would have to do their best to help Finn grow stronger. If that meant they had to sacrifice themselves for a day of partying, then this was a sacrifice they were willing to pay. Next to explain were Phaenis and Mina. Phaenis had been chosen by Phobos, the Olympian god of fear in battle. Her first class had become Threat Walker, while Mountain Brigand became her secondary skill. The class came with a lot of skills pertaining to the fear of an opponent and mixing illusions based on it into battle. Mina had gained 2 blessings. The first was the blessing of Sekhmet, which improved her combat prowess and granted her a skill that could passively add plague effect to her magic. The second was the blessing of Menhit. It had a similar effect to the blessing of violence on Mike's sword and would grant her power with every kill in battle. Now all eyes were on Jonah. The man had been rather silent, with his hand covering his face the whole time. Ah, hey Archer, didn't you say you were also chosen? Jonah changed the topic. A shiver went down their spines when they heard the melodic, androgynous voice. Was this still Jonah? Yes, the goddess of archery, Setet granted me her power, he explained. Previously Archer had reached the class of Bow Demon with a secondary class of Emerald Scout. Now the Bow Demon class became his secondary class, while his first class became Divine Archer, which flat out improved all his archery skills across the board and added divine magic into the mix. I still need to look through everything that was added, he ended his lackluster explanation of his gains. All eyes went back to Jonah. Don't look at me. I really don't want to talk about it, the man in question said depressed, still covering his face since the mask was broken in exchange for saving his life from the surprise attack. If you tell me, I will make you a new mask, Seth whispered to him mischievously. Jonah, who had been covering his face the whole time, slowly lowered his hand. He wore the detecting full beard and it was drenched in tears. Despite that, a gasp went through the crowd when they saw his face. The vampiric swordsman was not just terribly handsome anymore, he had become drop-dead gorgeous with a face as smooth as marble and long, blonde eyelashes. He looked like a teenager's wet dream that jumped right out of a romance comic. At the same time, he was the embodiment of sorrow, with his big, deer-like eyes glistening with tears. Even Seth was silent, feeling his heart resonate with the aura of tragedy Jonah emitted. Just what happened? How much had his personality attribute increased for him to look like this? A face that men and women alike would fall for, it reminded him of some Olympian myths. Although Seth felt his heartache and the urge to comfort the pitiful creature in front of him, he didn't. Because he knew. The blacksmith knew that Jonah didn't appreciate this turn of events. He had not known Jonah before the apocalypse, but according to him, he had been a bulky hunk with pride in his voluptuous beard. It had already been a hard hit when the class of vampiric swordsmen had turned him into a slender pretty boy. Somehow, he had drifted even further from his ideal of a big, muscular man. When Seth looked at him now, he got the impression that he had become even more slender and petite. The blacksmith had to acknowledge that his physique had become a work of art. With just a brief glance Seth could see that although his muscles had become very lean, they were defined and well balanced. They seemed to have become fully specialized in quick, agile combat. It was a brief glance, but it was already all he could glean from it. Maybe a sculptor would have been more interested than him. I'm hideous. Stop staring, he cried out pitifully and covered his face again before he started to explain. He had become the chosen of a deity called Munira, the goddess of gruesome beauty in battle, and his personality attribute went through the roof. Personality was an attribute that had many variations from charisma, to charm, to intimidation. Obviously, in Jonah's case, it was an overwhelming charm. Previously his classes after his advancements were Sanguine Swordmaster and Blood Abbot, which evolved from Blood Monk. After becoming the chosen of Munira, the Blood Abbot class turned into Munira's Apostle and became his primary class. Jonah also gained all kinds of special combat skills that were merciless, elegant, and was supposed to be able to confuse and charm enemies in combat. Or so said their descriptions. It didn't quite work on the general he was fighting, which indicated that the power of the skills was also reliant on the target's sense of aesthetics and not just how charming Jonah was. While Seth managed to keep the conversation going, the other were mostly staring in awe. The blacksmith could only pity and envy Jonah. This was probably what Adonis had to suffer through. Monique, what about you? He suddenly asked the salivation second in command. Ah. Me? She stammered embarrassedly, being caught staring. Yes, well, I got the blessing of a goddess called Athena, she said with an awkward smile. So, what did you gain? Seth asked her, staring at her in shock. She had been blessed by one of the main gods of Olympus. Ah, well, aside from an improvement in spear arts and my physical attributes, I got the skills Athena's spear, Athena's strategy, and Aegis. She listed her gains. The first was a spear-throwing skill she had used to kill the fleeing Mantidi general. The last meshed in with her class as Turtle Warrior and her defensive fighting style, as it allowed her to block damage easier and gave a low chance to petrify an enemy that was blocked. Monique described Athena's strategy as a skill with a passive and active component. Passively it allowed for a clear mind in combat and gave assistance in planning ahead while keeping their surroundings into account. Actively, it would slightly buff troops under one's command. Ah, Jonah, Lydia, could you show me your weapons for a moment? He asked the three to stay back because they had the surviving angel equipment. Seth had gotten the notification that one of his items had grown to become a legend, and even got a reward for it, but he doubted any of his relics had done anything to do so. The only thing he could think of was that the system had finally finished observing the angel items and acknowledged one of the as legendary, so he wanted to take a look. He already knew that it wasn't Bulko's helmet, so the only ones in question were the weapon that Lydia and Jonah had put in their inventory. It wasn't surprising when he said that Jonah's sword had finally gotten a full description. It already had the most readable appraisal information thanks to the Empire's experiment. Sword of Chains. Special. Damage, 2175. Durability, 4000. 1 Enslave. 2 plus 75% damage against the Divine. 375% chance to cause silence on hit. 450% chance to cause paralysis on hit. 525% chance to cause local metallification on hit. 6 active skill, Divine Chains. 7 active skill, Control. A divine weapon filled with the power of the God of Chains. Created by Master Smith, the first blacksmith of Earth, from the body of an archangel. It didn't have the greatest basic damage, but the effects made more than up for this. Enslave had a 5 to 15 chance to enslave an opponent that had lost the will to fight. It was a 100% chance on people that showed no resistance at all. Control allowed the wielder to force someone to follow their order, as long as the sword threatened their lives. This was the effect that the researchers of Krna described as the ability to make someone tell the truth if the sword was pointed at their throat. Divine Chains was an area of effect snare that allowed the wielder to summon literal chains to bind enemies in the surroundings. Seth explained the effects to Jonah and the others, which were followed by a wave of congratulations to Jonah. It also helped cheer up the depressed swordsman. They kept talking about what to do from now on for a while before they finally split up so everyone could go get some sleep. I will have the golem stand guard. Everyone deserves a good rest. Seth sent Mina ahead and stayed outside for a moment longer after setting up the golems. The blacksmith wanted to check his own gains from this battle. Chapter 677 Calling of Seth had accumulated a whopping 133 attribute points and 12 skill points. However, the point his eyes wandered to first was the secondary class advancement that was unlocked when he reached Level 80. He wanted to decide where to use his points after choosing the direction of his Infernal Scald class. Checking his status, he had, once again, 4 traits he could choose from to decide on a specialization of his class. It was quite similar to his primary job advancement, especially when it came to the vague description of the traits. The 4 options were: Calling of the Minstrel, trait; Calling of the Vocalist, trait; Calling of the Smith, trait; Calling of the Maestro, trait. The first being an overall improvement of the musical aspects. A minstrel would master singing and playing one or several musical instruments at the same time. The only thing it left out were the crafting aspects of the Infernal Scald, like rune mastery and enchantment. In exchange, it would strengthen the power of his performances in battle. With the first giving an overall boost to all musical aspects, the second promised a strong buff to solely everything based on the voice. Pure a cappella singing, orations, and persuasion/taunting would be strengthened and supported with skills like multi-song that allowed the musician to recreate the effect of a choir, or sing multiple songs at the same time. Seth dismissed Call of the Vocalist right away since he already had skills like Voice of Seth and Orpheus Voice that did similar things. He found the trait redundant. For the same reasons, he dismissed the third. The Bard was already a master blacksmith. He doubted the specialization of a class that was focused on music and enchantments could give him any great boost at this point. He might have thought differently before, but after reaching the master tier, Seth was more interested in strengthening what he was lacking in. The last trait was really what surprised him with its name because of the recent news that a maestro was in the process of conquering the Holy Land. The calling of the maestro was quite similar to the blood of the inventor, the trait he has chosen when he advanced to the spirit blacksmith class. A maestro was not just someone that could create armies of demonic monsters. They also created devices by mastering and combining many different disciplines, unhindered by classes. One could have thought of the call of the maestro as the opposite of call of the minstrel, as it said to buff all crafting-related skills. But there was one unique thing about this trait that made it the trait of maestros, long-lived demons that bloomed in their work. The buffs the call of the maestro gave were not some flat improvements to all crafting skills or items made, but were based on the number of crafting skills mastered and used on an item. Many demons had unimaginably long lifespans. The older a maestro was, the stronger and more fearsome they would become, as they perfected the fusion of the disciplines they mastered. It was the perfect trait for someone with all the time in the world and the motivation to master skills. Or for someone with the buffs and capital to level crafting skills really quickly. Dismissing the second and third options, the question was now between an immediate growth in power or a slow-burning coal fire with explosive potential. Who was he kidding? The choice was obvious. Looking at the path he walked so far, he already was not so different from a maestro. Despite being apprehensive at first, he had long been dedicated to his role as a craftsman. Ding! You have gained the trait Call of the Maestro. New skills have been added to your skills. Please check your skill window. Seth felt a power flow through him, as the trait was engraved on his status window. Now that he had chosen this option, he looked at it again in his status. Call of the Maestro, proficiency and power of all crafting skills are improved. Its description had slightly changed from its introduction, but the other effects were probably helpful in the skills he had gained. But even this trait was quite good, as it also improved his proficiency. Curious, he checked his skill window. The additions to his skill window that accompanied the trait were the passive skills Master of all Trades, Composer of Fusion, and 2 new perks. Blueprint gained an advanced simulation function that took all possible materials the blacksmith could use and make with his skills into account. Blacksmith's Eyes had gained the ability to appraise all materials and items based on the level of the dominant skill used in the production or processing of the item or material. That meant that if he learned Alchemy, Beginner, he would be able to appraise all materials a beginner could use and all items a beginner could make. However, it lacked the ability to get blueprints, or in this case, potion recipes. The perks already seemed quite useful. Next, he checked the new skills. Passive skill, Master of all Trades. Allows the user to learn all basic crafting skills as primary skills and eases the acquisition requirements for all crafting-related skills. This was a great skill. Although it meant more work, since a primary skill had 2 tiers more to reach the master tier, the passive bonus of a primary skill was much stronger because of this additional growth. This meant, when it came to crafting, the only restriction to the quality of his products was his own will to grind the skill and no longer any class traits. Looking at the next skill, Seth was surprised when he found that it was already Level 3. Passive skill, Composer of Fusion. Helps with the fusion and understanding of different crafting disciplines. Improves the power and resonance of items based on the mastery of the skills used during crafting. May improve an item's stats based on skill level, currently 15% to 30%. Skill level depends on every crafting skill that reached the master tier or max level. There was the promised strengthening based on the number of mastered skills. This also explained why the skill was already on Level 3. But it wasn't just strengthening, as he understood it, it could also help Seth in creating synergies in items. This fell in line with his resolve to concentrate on concentrating in a specific direction when making items in the future. It was after he became a master and made the first batch of legendary items, that Seth realized something. In the past, he had used all his abilities to imbue power into the items he made to artificially raise their rating. Although he tried to match the powers, the diverse skill sets were hard on the users and also lowered their quality, even with a higher ranking. Most relics he made only had a low chance to become legendary and Seth was convinced this was the reason. Until now it had been a habit he acquired from trying to raise his skill as quickly as possible. Now, however, he had realized that it was not necessary anymore. He was already a master and no matter how hard he struggled, he wouldn't be able to raise his tier anytime soon again. The Bringer of Winter Woes was his first step in this new direction. Although it had no few effects, they were much more concentrated on strengthening a single kind of effect instead of being partially solitary effects. This skill would help him mesh such skills even better together, but it would be an even bigger help when making golems or other devices that needed many different enchantments and materials to guarantee their function. With the addition of other crafting skills, he would also be able to bring a higher variety of materials into the mix that could lead to better results and synergies with souls and enchantments. A good example was his bow. The Mind Reaper bow was made from a piece of wood that had previously not been acknowledged as a crafting material by Blacksmith's eyes. Looking at all the skills and possibilities Seth already possessed when it came to production, it made little sense if he kept restricting himself to the materials fit to be used by a blacksmith alone. The Golem Forge was a good example, that Forgebrand had also gone in a similar direction. The crafting station did not differentiate between materials and obviously used more than blacksmith, goldsmith, or enchantment skills in its working process. Forgebrand was not the only example. Hephaestus was also a god of craftsmen, although being a blacksmith was his most prominent feature. Thinking about the possibilities that opened, he realized that his growth as a craftsman was far from over. Chapter 678 Soul Refinery. He mused about the implications of the new perk and skills for a while, before he turned his attention somewhere else. His attribute points and skill points still waited to be distributed. The first 8 of the 133 APS went into strength to bring it from 292 to 300. He was curious whether he would gain another skill if he did so and he was not disappointed. Ding! Title, Spartan gained. Your strength has reached 300 points. You gained the skill flexing. Maybe he was a little disappointed. The title was okay, but when he checked his skill window for the description of flexing, it became a little embarrassing. Active skill, flexing, no cost, no cooldown. Usage requirement, at least bare-chested. Based on the strength difference with your target, you have a chance to startle onlookers when using flexing. The skill was literally taking off your clothes and flexing your muscles like a bodybuilder. He did not try it out and quickly tried to forget about it. Did this mean he would get a title and a weird skill like this for all his attributes that reached 300? To test his theory, he put another 20 points in dexterity and promptly had another notification. Ding! Title, Dory gained. Your dexterity has reached 300 points. You gained the skill thrust. For a moment Seth expected the worst, but he heaved a sigh of relief when he remembered that thrust was a basic skill for the spear and had nothing to do with anything remotely close to what flexing was. Thrust was a passive skill that dealt an additional 15% damage when thrusting with a weapon. It was no awe-inspiring skill, but nice to have. Definitely better than flexing. The next attribute closest to 300 was endurance, so he added 26 points to endurance. He grimaced when he gained another questionable skill. Ding! Title, Phalanx gained. Your endurance has reached 300 points. You gained the skill Hot Gates. Luckily, it was more normal than the name suggested. Hot Gates was a passive skill that improved defense by 15% when in a stable defensive position. Now Seth was left with 79 attribute points. The options were getting willpower or agility to 300, or splitting them among them and intelligence. Well, one thing was clear for Seth, he didn't need any more agility at the moment. He could barely handle the speed he had with his armor. On the other hand, he was a little sad about how endurance had managed to leave willpower in the dust after using the body refining pills. He needed willpower for a lot of things, especially his abilities like pyrokinesis and his skills pertaining the working with skills. The decision was rather easy. He uses 67 of his points on willpower and put the rest on intelligence, bringing them to 300 and 226. Ding! Title: Entrenched gained. Your willpower has reached 300 points. You gained the skill Unfaltering. Finally, a skill and title that both seemed normal. Unfaltering was another passive skill. It improved the resistance to mental attacks and status effects by a flat 15%. It was a little redundant since Leroy, his helmet, gave him 100% immunity to such effects thanks to the blessing of Lethe. Still, he wasn't complaining. After all, the skill would be working, even if he didn't wear his helmet. It was just a shame that none of these skills could be improved. All of them came with the max tag from the start. He couldn't even try to use skill points on them. After distributing the APS, he turned to the skill points. He had 12 shiny points that could improve his skills. Although he had just gotten the trait that brought a lot of goodies if he improved his crafting skills, Seth had already kind of decided what he was going to improve. Even though Ceres was unable to tell him anything more, after seeing the Golem Forge, Seth decided that he had to max out the Spirit Smithy. Getting the smithy to level 8 would cost 9 SPS. There was a chance that it would not gain a new perk with the next level, but the blacksmith didn't mind. He was determined to use all the skill points he would get on the Spirit Smithy until it was maxed out. He selected the skill and used 9 points to upgrade it. When he was what the new level brought with it, he fell silent. After a moment he summoned a desk. It was a square desk made of black obsidian, with outlandish carvings on its top. Set in the middle stood a big device with the edge almost on eye level with Seth. It looked almost like an hourglass, with a big funnel made of crystal glass above and a conical flask of the same material below. This was crazy, an absolutely insane invention. It was preposterous, appalling, incredible, and downright ingenious. This was the Soul Refinery. Literally a distillery for souls that could purify, or reduce souls like they were water or spirits. Its description said that it could directly refine huge numbers of low-quality souls not only into bigger souls but also souls with a higher rating because it got rid of the fragments during the process. The outcome would be a clean slate of greater size and higher rank. If one wanted to use it as a pure power source, it was perfect. The other option was to tell it to reduce souls with similar abilities, into a soul with a stronger ability created from the culmination of all souls used. This was similar to what Seth had done with the Archer and Duelist souls, but much easier and probably more effective than the blacksmith doing it by hand. Together with the Golem Forge, these two crafting stations showed that Forge Right had completely turned into a crazy scientist as time progressed. And that he was big in the golem business. What else was the dwarf supposed to do with the souls, right? Well, it wasn't really important what Forge Brown used it for, now Seth had it. He wasn't quite sure what he was going to use it for, but he was sure he could find some good use for it. Having spent 9 skill points on Spirit Smithy, he had 3 left to save up for the next stage of the skill. They had not been here for long, but he had already gained a lot looking at his other class skill. He was sure Soul Infusion and Soul Capture would level up soon. Especially Soul Capture, he could feel that it had made a good jump with the souls he had passively collected from the battlefield. Despite not going out of his way to collect all of them, he had collected over 700 common medium souls and a good bunch of big common and uncommon souls, too. The only soul and body he deliberately went to collect were those of the Mantity General Monique managed to kill. Scythe Assassin's Soul, big, rare. Soul of a high-level insect monster that excelled in ambush and melee combat. High attainment in camouflage, assassination skills, and dual-wielding scythes. Trait, Twin Blade. It was regrettable that Seth did not have the chance to harvest it directly. The blacksmith had gotten better at gauging the size of souls without relying on just the system description. As big could mean anything between 1000 to 10.000 mana. It was a great disparity of the size a big soul could have. The Scythe Assassin's soul was big, but just on the cusp of being massive. Had he directly harvested it, it would have probably been double or more its current size. But he quickly realized that this was not a loss. Not anymore. Now he had the soul refinery. This was the simplest to understand function. If he used it to refine and purify a bunch of smaller souls, he could get a big, completely clean soul. Without impurities in the souls, there would be much fewer negative effects to fusing souls to improve their size. He could go even further, but it was currently not the time to explore the way to use the soul refinery. He had been standing around outside for too long and quickly went to their tent, to accompany Mina for the night. It was a long day, it was just the beginning. Chapter 679 Practicing Caution. The atmosphere was heavy in the court of insects. Nobody dared to speak up after hearing the report of what happened during the campaign. What was supposed to be a glorious invasion turned into a catastrophic failure. Although the loss of foot soldiers was negligible, their elites had taken a heavy hit, and most of their generals came back with heavy wounds. One even lost his life. The silence came with heavy pressure. Had they been able to, the insectoid advisors would have been sweating under the gaze of their king. The queen is not amused, the booming voice said with a force that made glittering dust fall from the bioluminescent mushrooms at the ceiling. While the foot soldiers were merely things created with the power of the dungeon, the elites were her descendants, and the generals were direct offspring. It took an immense amount of energy to give birth to offspring of such level, which meant that the Mantidi general and the heavily injured Grillatalpadi general were actually their greatest loss. The advisors were shaking in their boots. They knew someone would have to pay for this, but the water scorpion that had originally suggested this campaign had miraculously vanished after the troops set off. Everyone could only silently curse him and themselves for going along with it for some inexplicable reason. Only the regal-looking mantis monster was not afraid to be punished, as the only one who suggested taking caution and scouting the camp beforehand. Still, he was not happy. He was grieving a loss, as the general who died was his great-great-grandfather. The silence was broken by a messenger moth making its way to the figure hidden in the darkness of the throne. "Enter," the booming voice commanded in a booming voice. The gates opened and a moth scout entered. It had a petite frame and used its big wings like a cloak. It walked down the aisle between the row of advisors and knelt down before the throne. At the wave of the king's hand, the scout started to report. "We lost contact with the entrances on the upper levels. All people we sent have gone missing. The commanders on site suspect the soft-skins have started infiltrating the nest. They ask for permission to dispatch elite troops to stop their advance." Everyone was silent until the moth finished its detailed report. They were taken aback. It had barely been a day since their combined force clashed with the soft-skins and was forced to retreat. They had lost a third of their elites when they attacked in a group. Now they asked to split them up and send them to their death? On the other hand, they couldn't just let an enemy force carve a path of blood through their territory and do nothing. They had learned from their mistake. Before, everyone was eager to support what seemed like an obvious decision, only to be taught a lesson. Now nobody wanted to step forward and suggested what obviously had to be done. "Any suggestions?" the booming voice asked in the room. No. At this point, the king had already made the decisions, but he wanted to see if any of the advisors had the confidence to step up and suggest it, too. His question was a test, not a genuine answer for a solution. "Your Highness." The regal mantis stepped forward. "Speak. Once again, I suggest practicing caution. We don't have enough information on the invaders, except that they are strong enough to leave no witnesses. I suggest we rely on numbers instead of strength to find out the strength of the enemy." The king was pleasantly surprised that the mantis had not only the gall to stand up, but also refrained from uttering utter garbage, but an actually usable suggestion. "Elaborate." "Yes. I suggest we send a legion of foot soldiers together with a detachment of Zygoptera scouts to several of the entrances for reconnaissance. With these kinds of numbers, the scouts should have a greater chance to get valuable information and escape. Even if the foot soldiers get wiped out, it's still a smaller price than sacrificing elites for such a task." Using several legions and a huge number of Zygoptera scouts was a bold suggestion and had the room split in mutters of agreement and disagreement. Even though the lower breeds used as foot soldiers were just beasts spawned with the power of the dungeon, it didn't mean they came at no cost. It was not exactly what the king had in mind, but it was a suggestion good enough to be used. From his perspective, any elite unit was worth a lot more than a legion of cannon fodder. "We shall proceed with your suggestion." In the beginning, Monique had been weirded out by the Faer and the fact that Seth had technically revived them. The golems were one thing, but that their tower master had already made the step to creating people was hard to swallow. They were all people from other worlds, which made them feel like time travelers that were completely unfamiliar with their culture and world. There were also many with not quite human features, or from straight-up fantasy races among them. However, after interacting with them, she soon realized that they were also just people. Most of them had a military background and a tragic past, but what else they managed to remember of their lives seemed like normal relatable experiences. Although there was a setting-in period, with Myanmar already being a hodgepodge of people, it didn't take long for them to find their place. Now Monique was tasked with leading 5 parties, a group of 40 Fair, in their attack on the hive. It was time for the Fair to farm levels and the field teams had been split up to accompany them in case elites or generals appeared. Everyone else only had one party to look after, but Monique had been given command over a fifth of the Fair. She had tried to argue against it, but Seth had been quite adamant about this. If you lead a bigger force and prove your strategic abilities in combat, I'm sure you can rank up to become Athena's chosen in no time, was what he said. This was why such a big responsibility was forced onto her. The only silver lining was that she was given the teams with the most military experience. Each team leader under her had been in a commanding position in their past life and proven their leadership quality during their time in Mina's march. They were able to give good counsel and follow orders. It made her job easier, but her responsibility all the heavier. If she messed up even with this setup, it would be her responsibility alone. So far there had been no problems. Her troop of Fair had been shuttled by Python and invaded one of the big hive structures that were sticking out from the cliffs of the canyon like tumorous growths. At first, the insect monsters inside these hives had given them a lot of resistance. This had also given Monique the chance to experience one of the strengths of the Fair. They had frighteningly high base stats and were able to ignore more injuries. The mandibles, claws, and other weapons of the insect army were too weak to dismember them. In a horrifying display of strength, they completely ignored any flesh wounds. Even if their faces were melted off by acid spit, they didn't even flinch as they kept swinging their weapons and casting their spells. Despite being the smallest in number, the mages of the Faer may very well be the most frightening unit among them. They were just as tanky as the warriors, were almost impossible to interrupt while casting, and used powerful magic that wiped out entire rooms of insects at a time. They also had no problems with the stronger insect monsters that would appear as leaders and magicians on the enemy side. The only drawback was probably that their level only increased slowly. Even when they were tirelessly wiping out beasts 20 levels higher than them, their level barely rose. So, while the Faer were occupied with pest control, Monique made sure nobody was able to report back. It was the best she could do, as the current enemies would not help her level up. She could only check her level with a sigh. She had hit level 90 in the recent battle, but even killing the Mantidi general had only given her 30% to level 91. These level 70 and level 80 mobs barely put a dent in her experience bar. It seemed like the needed experience increased exponentially starting with level 90. There was nothing she could do about this for now. Instead, she concentrated on improving her skills and mastering those given by Athena to become stronger. Athena's spear was especially useful to take care of those that tried to flee. It allowed her to throw a copy of her spear. Although the power of the copy was only 25% of the original at level 1 of the skill, it was more than enough to take care of the stragglers. Currently, they had left behind the hive structure and entered the dark tunnels that lead into the rock of the canyon. Whereas the hive structure still had halls with skylights in the ceiling, these tunnels were barely illuminated by a kind of exotic mold or lichen that grew at the ceiling. A shadow appeared beside her, one of the very few assassins among the Faer. It was a very slim, agile harpy beastman. I have found a massive group of insects up ahead, marching in our direction. How many? It's hard to estimate as they're clog the tunnels. It's a hair-raising sight. Chapter 680 Monique's Battle. Seth stayed behind in the camp to not take too much of the Faer's experience for himself. Instead, he was working on a new mask for Jonah. Currently, the man was hiding his face behind the beard-shaped detection item Seth had given them some time ago. For this mask, he went a different route. Since Jonah was now the chosen of the goddess of gruesome beauty in battle, he could give her champion a demon face. Instead, Seth took inspiration from some visual novels he used to read. The face he tried to sculpt was beautiful, unearthly beautiful, and cold. Since Jonah didn't want to be charming, or cute, this was the best compromise between his preferences and divine blessing. An expressionless, beautiful face that seemed almost cruel, or menacing was the vibe he went for. It was a shame that Lydia was the only one that got a piece of special metal from her divine sugar daddy. Since the goddess of gruesome beauty was not nice enough to provide the materials, Seth used Olympian silver for the mask. He was in the middle of sculpting the mask, which gave him quite some trouble in his limited artistic vision when the orb in his pocket started vibrating over and over again. "We are massively outnumbered. We have to pull out." Mike reported about his situation and the group of Faer he was leading. He wasn't the only one to report the need to pull out. Several other parties had already begun retreating. It seemed like the bugs were not joking around and sent out over 1,000 soldiers to several of the entrances. This wouldn't have been a big problem if the members of the field team stepped in, but that was not the purpose of the invasion. The point was to have the Faer gain levels, which they couldn't if they were drowned in an ocean of enemies. The retreat was an obvious decision when facing this situation. Since there were some people he didn't hear anything from, he decided to call them to assemble with the others. When he called Monique, he could hear the noise of battle in the background. The screeching of bugs, the crunching of shells, it sounded like a big fight. "Monique? I heard that some people face huge numbers of enemies, but it sounds like you already know that." "What?" "Ah, yes. We are currently holding our position at a bottleneck of what seems like an old boss room," she confirmed their situation. "Do you need help?" "It's okay. There are quite a lot of them, but the Faer are faring well." "I see. Well, I was going to inform you that everyone is pulling out for now, but since you are already engaged, I guess it's a little late for you to get out now. Are you sure you can deal with it?" Although she seemed confident, she began to ponder and gave her answer some thought. After the call, Monique's eyes returned to the row of Faer that held the gateway into the boss room. Although the Faer had technically infinite stamina, the same wasn't true for their mana. Without mana they would have a hard time just moving, it could be called their only big weakness. To prevent this, she kept cycling people between resting, defense, and offense. This went great for another 30 minutes, but the cycles became shorter and shorter, while the enemy numbers showed no sign of dwindling. They had killed so many that corpses should have been piling to mountains outside the gate, but whenever one of their brethren died, the corpse was pulled back into the sea of legs, eyes, and shells. In disgust, she quickly realized that the hive ate their own dead to keep them from getting in the way. But it didn't matter. If things went bad, Monique could still step in. She immediately regretted thinking that as she belatedly evaded an attack from her blind spot. Despite evading, she felt a sharp pain in her nape. Tisk. Battle ready, she faced the enemy behind her, but it was already gone. Following a minute sound from the right, the spear demon managed to evade another launch for her neck and get a look at her attacker. Vespani General Leave 96, Boss. A roughly humanoid wasp the size of a child. Its many arms ended in golden claws and its black, faceted eyes emitted unmistakable malice. It didn't speak, but it was clear that it wanted Monique dead. Her thoughts raced. Tekker and Seth had talked about this one. Where did it come from? Monique took just a blink of time to observe the boss room to spot a hole in the floor behind the throne overgrown with hive matter. At this moment she realized that the position she had deemed easy to defend may not have been as safe as she thought. These giant insects were practiced in creating all kinds of tunnels. What would stop them to do so in their own dungeon? She wanted to smile in derision. She wanted to do as Seth had told her and try to impress the goddess of strategy, but she had miscalculated. The warrioress didn't have much time to think about it, as the general was back to attacking her. This was really the worst kind of situation. Unable to even check on how the Faer were doing, she had a hard time just keeping up with the wasp's attacks. It was too fast and its fighting style somewhat resembled Finn's. The wasp kept using its speed and skills to get in her blind spot to attack with her claws or stinger. Only her dynamic vision trained through martial arts focused on counters and strengthened by the system was currently keeping her alive against the enemy attacks. She couldn't keep up with its speed to get a chance to attack, but she slowly grew confident in her ability to dodge and defend. Like in a haze, the wasp's attacks seemed to become predictable as she got used to the attack pattern. Except, it wasn't. The moment she wanted to block the next attack, a sudden bout of vertigo hit her hard, completely breaking her stance. The attack she anticipated did not come, the wasp had vanished from her sight like a phantom. The next thing she knew was that she was flying into the row of Faer with a terrifying pain in her stomach. Kneeling on the ground among the people fallen around her, she needed a moment to realize what had happened. The wasp had managed to escape from her view and stabbed her in the stomach with the stinger. The attack had not penetrated her armor, but the impact still churned her insides. How did that happen? What was this vertigo? The haze? She had to throw up to feel slightly better. Belatedly she checked her status to see that he was under the poison status. No wonder. She immediately realized that it must have been the wound in her nape. She could only curse her own vanity and overconfidence. If she had just worn her helmet, there would have been no way for this to happen. Her realization happened in a matter of moments. While she was stuck in her short stupor, things took a turn for the worse. She had been catapulted straight into the defending line of fire. Now, the nightmarish hordes of insects flooded into the boss room. When she came to it, there was not much she could do to turn the situation around. She managed to barely evade the general's next attack and finally equip her helmet. Not a moment too late, as her head was thrown back from a heavy impact just after wearing it. This was embarrassing, but she had no choice. Monique lay down on the ground and rolled together like a turtle. Turtle Warrior's defense curl. Trusting her armor and the skill's power, she bought a moment of time to drink an antidote potion. The price was a terrible bruise on her back, as the skill and armor were not enough to completely dampen the attack of the Leave 96 boss insect. Still a little wobbly on her legs, she managed to stand up. Monique could already feel her head clearing, after drinking Allison's antidote potion. She grimaced when she saw their current situation. The Fae were drowning in enemies. She doubted the buff of Athena's strategy would have helped much, even if she was able to use it. Monique could barely stand straight while being bombarded by the Wasp General, much less use any skills to support her allies. Although the Vespani General's level was lower, it was a much harder fight than the giant mantis. She shook her head. It didn't matter, her spirit was unbroken. With her mind clearing up, she would go all out, kill the general and then buy enough time. Hump.